Have you ever heard a sound so beautiful it felt dangerous? A melody that seemed to hold a secret power, one that called to you with a whisper of ancient, forgotten truths. In the deepest archives of the Elven world, within the hallowed halls of the Verdant Spire, such songs were not just stories. They were forbidden knowledge, locked away under a vow of eternal silence. And it is here, amidst towering shelves of ancient scrolls, that our story begins with a single, deliberate hum. Before we step into that silent archive together, we would love to know where you're joining us from on this journey, and what hour of the day or night finds you listening. Let us know in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see the community of curious minds we're building across the world. Picture the scene. The air is thick with the scent of old parchment and polished wood. Sunlight filters through stained glass windows, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the silence. This is the domain of the most revered scholars, the guardians of Elven history. And among them is a young lore seeker named Elara. Her heart beats not just with a thirst for knowledge, but with a restless, burning curiosity that the quiet, rigid rules of the archive could never satisfy. She had been told her entire life that the most potent songs, the ones said to have shaped the world itself, were far too dangerous to be sung. They were relics, to be studied in theory, but never, ever given voice. But for Elara, a song without sound was a story without a soul. It was a mystery begging to be solved. So, on a day like any other, surrounded by the weight of centuries of enforced quiet, she made a choice that would change everything. She parted her lips, and she hummed a forbidden melody. The note was soft at first, little more than a vibration in the back of her throat, but in the absolute silence of the spire, it rang out like a bell. It was a fragment of a tune she had pieced together from coded manuscripts and half-erased musical notations. A beautiful, haunting strand of music that felt strangely familiar, as if she had always known it. The immediate consequence was not some magical explosion, but something far more telling: the icy, furious glare of a senior scholar from across the room. In that moment, Elara didn't just break a rule, she challenged the very foundation of her society. Why would something so inherently beautiful be treated as a threat? What were the ancient scholars so afraid of? Her simple act of curiosity set her on a collision course with the most powerful elves in the spire, risking her hard-won place among them not for glory or power, but for an answer. She was about to discover that the songs were not merely history, they were a lock, and she had just begun to turn the key. This is the story of the hidden societies of Elven scholars who guard the ancient songs, and the one seeker who dared to ask why. The silence that followed her transgression was heavier than any she had known before. It was not the peaceful quiet of study, but a thick, judgmental stillness that seemed to press in from the very walls of the Verdant Spire. For 3 days, Elara went about her duties under a cloud of whispered conversations that ceased the moment she entered a room. The other junior scholars looked at her with a mixture of awe and pity, as if she were already a ghost, haunting the halls she once hoped to master. Then the summons came. It was not delivered by a messenger, but by a single, weightless leaf of enchanted silver that drifted down from the upper levels to land silently upon the page of the text she was reading. The rune etched upon it was unmistakable, the sigil of the Council of Quills. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she climbed the winding staircase to the council chamber, a place she had only ever seen from a distance. It was a circular room open to the sky, with arches carved to look like the feathers of a giant quill pen. Seated in a semicircle were the 7 senior archivists, their faces etched with the lines of centuries of study and stern judgment. At the center sat Archivist Fenler, his posture as rigid as the ancient oak staff he held, his eyes the color of a winter sky, fixed upon her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Elara of the Willow Glen, he began, his voice not loud, but carrying with a clarity that filled the entire chamber. You stand before this council for a breach of our most sacred law. Present the evidence of your curiosity. This was the moment she had dreaded, and in a secret part of her soul, anticipated. She stepped forward and placed her worn leather journal on the central pedestal. It was filled not with reckless scrawls, but with meticulous notes, cross-referenced historical accounts, and her own carefully reasoned theories about the melodic structures of the forbidden songs. She did not apologize. Instead, she began to speak, her voice gaining strength as she explained her findings. She argued that the songs were not simply dangerous artifacts, but complex historical texts whose meaning had been lost through generations of fear. She suggested that by refusing to understand their true nature, the council was leaving themselves vulnerable to the very dangers they sought to contain. This was not the passive acceptance of a reprimand that they expected. It was a debate. One of the other council members, an elder elf with kind eyes named Lyra, leaned forward with genuine interest, asking a question about a specific harmonic sequence Alara had noted. But Fenler cut the exchange short. You speak of understanding, he boomed, his patience clearly at an end. But you demonstrate only recklessness. You played with forces you cannot comprehend, like a child striking a flame in a library. These songs are not for interpretation. They are a containment system, a lock on a door behind which sleeps a silence that would devour all sound, all memory, all life as we know it. Your theories are a danger to every soul in this spire. The confrontation was absolute. Her innovative spirit, her desire to truly know, crashed directly against the unyielding wall of tradition that Fenler represented. He saw her actions not as scholarly pursuit, but as a threat to the very fabric of their world. With a final, grim pronouncement, he gestured, and her journal was swept from the pedestal into the hands of a guard. Your research is hereby confiscated, Fenler declared. Your access to the upper archives is revoked. You are reassigned to the lower archives. You will catalog and sort the incoming scrolls from the outer provinces. Perhaps the tedium of managing forgotten tax records and weather reports will teach you the value of the silence you so carelessly broke. The punishment was a masterstroke of scholarly cruelty. It physically separated her from the ancient texts she loved, consigning her to the dust-choked, windowless chambers deep beneath the spire, a place where ambition went to die. But as she stood there, her hands empty, her arguments dismissed, a new resolve crystallized within Alara. They could take her notes, they could banish her from the beautiful, sunlit halls, but they could not erase the melody now humming in her memory, or the burning questions it had ignited. In that moment, she made her choice. She would not obey. She would continue her research in secret. This defiance, born not of childish rebellion, but of a profound conviction, would define her path forward. Her standing in the community was now shattered, a precarious ledge from which a single misstep would mean a fall into exile. Yet, the stakes only made her purpose feel more vital. Later, surrounded by the scent of mildew and aged parchment, in the oppressive quiet of the lower archives, Elara's world had shrunk to stacks of mundane scrolls. The task was as monotonous as Fenler had intended, but as she reached to place a particularly heavy bundle of provincial crop yields onto a high shelf, her fingers, numb with dust and disappointment, brushed against a seam in the stone wall that felt different. It was not rough, but smooth, and it shifted almost imperceptibly under her touch, a hidden compartment, long forgotten by the scholars who walked the halls above. Her heart, which had been heavy with defeat, now hammered against her ribs with a frantic, hopeful rhythm. The smooth seam in the stone wall had given way under the gentle pressure of her searching fingers, not with a loud click, but with a soft, grinding whisper that was swallowed by the dust of the lower archives. A section of the bookshelf, impossibly heavy, swung inward just enough to reveal a narrow, dark opening. A gust of air, surprisingly cool and carrying the faint, sweet scent of pressed lilacs, flowed out from the darkness. This was no simple storage nook. This was a place meant to be forgotten. Alara slipped through the opening, her elven eyes quickly adjusting to the deep gloom. The hidden alcove was small, barely larger than a closet, an empty save for a single pedestal of polished obsidian, and on that pedestal rested a single object, a leaf. But this was no ordinary leaf from the forests surrounding the spire. It was crafted from a single, flawless piece of crystal, so clear it was almost invisible except for the delicate veins that ran through it, which seemed to be filled with captured moonlight. As she approached, a faint vibration hummed through the air, a sensation more felt than heard. It was a silent song, a resonance that tickled the edges of her perception. The crystal leaf was singing, but its melody was one of pure energy, a secret harmonic meant for feeling, not for hearing. With a reverence usually reserved for the most sacred texts, Elara reached out and carefully lifted the leaf from its resting place. It was cool to the touch, but the moment her skin made contact, the silent song intensified, flowing up her arm like a gentle current. This was not a destructive or dangerous power. It felt ancient, yes, but also profoundly beautiful, like a memory of the first sunrise. The discovery was a thunderous validation of every suspicion she had dared to voice before the council. Archivist Fenler had spoken of the songs as a terrible, dangerous lock, a burden to be borne in solemn silence. But this hidden artifact, tucked away in the deepest, most forgotten part of the archives, told a different story. It was proof that the council, or someone within it, was actively hiding pieces of the puzzle. They weren't just guarding knowledge from the outside world, they were compartmentalizing it, even from their own scholars. The leaf was a tangible clue, a piece of evidence that her quest for understanding was not heretical, but necessary. Now, however, she possessed something far more incriminating than a theory in a journal. She was holding a forbidden artifact, a piece of protected knowledge that she had effectively stolen. The weight of the crystal leaf in her palm felt immense, not with physical heft, but with consequence. From that moment forward, every glance from another scribe in the dusty corridors felt like a potential accusation. The low, constant tension of being watched became the backdrop of her days. She had to hide her discovery perfectly. She found a small, empty scroll case meant for holding maps and carefully nestled the leaf inside, wrapped in a soft piece of linen. She kept it on her person at all times, a secret warmth against her side, a constant reminder of the dangerous path she was now walking. The risk had escalated dramatically. Her earlier transgression was disobedience, a challenge to authority. Now it was theft. If she were caught, exile would be a merciful punishment compared to what the council might do to someone who possessed a hidden relic. This new reality forced a critical decision. She could not risk studying the leaf in the open, not even in the relative solitude of the lower archives. Her investigation would have to become a creature of the night. She committed herself to a dangerous, solitary routine. During the day, she performed her menial duties with a convincing air of resigned acceptance, all the while observing the patterns of the night watch, learning the gaps in their patrols. When the spire fell into its deepest silence, in the hours when even the most dedicated scholars had retired, she would retreat to her small sleeping chamber. There, by the faint light of a single glow moss lamp, she would unwrap the crystal leaf. She didn't try to sing its song. Instead, she would simply hold it, focusing on the intricate patterns of its veins, trying to decipher the story they held. The leaf's energy was not constant. It would ebb and flow, and she began to notice a pattern. Each night, just as the moon reached its zenith, the leaf's vibration would intensify into a soft, rhythmic pulse. It was a syncopated beat that seemed to echo something distant, a call and response with a power far older than the stone walls around her. And if she listened with more than her ears, straining her senses to their limit, she could just make out the source of that response, the faint, disciplined chant of the senior scholars emanating from the one place in the spire that was always off limits, the solitary and mysterious Starfall Tower. The leaf was not just a clue, it was a compass, and its needle was pointing unmistakably toward the tower, drawing her attention to the heart of the mystery. The rhythmic pulse of the crystal leaf became a countdown in Alara's pocket, a silent metronome measuring the nights until the celestial event she knew was her only chance. The archivist spoke in hushed, excited tones of the upcoming meteor shower, the tears of the celestial stag, an annual spectacle that drew the eyes of every elf in the spire skyward. For Elara, it was not a time for wonder, but for action. The distraction was perfect. As the first brilliant streaks of light began to paint the night sky, eliciting gasps and pointing fingers from the scholars gathered in the courtyards below, she moved. Dressed in a dark, hooded cloak that blended with the shadows, she slipped away from the crowd and into the network of narrow service passages that threaded through the spire like forgotten veins. Her destination was the Starfall Tower, a slender, isolated structure connected to the main archive by a single, open-air bridge. It was always guarded, its purpose a mystery taught only to the most senior members of the council. Tonight, however, the sentinel at the bridge's entrance was distracted, his face tilted upward to the dazzling display overhead. Holding her breath, Elara darted across the stone span, a fleeting shadow against the starry canvas, and pressed herself against the cold, iron-banded door of the tower. To her astonishment, it was unlocked. It seemed the scholars inside, too, wished to observe the shower without obstruction. She slipped inside, and the world changed. The air itself was different, charged, thin, and humming with a power that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The interior of the tower was a single, vast cylinder, open to the heavens through a crystalline dome. And the walls, they were alive. From floor to a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow, the curved stone was covered in intricate, glowing etchings. They were not words or pictures, but musical notations of impossible complexity, staff lines that curved like planetary orbits, and notes that shimmered with the light of distant suns. This was no dusty archive of dead songs. This was an active instrument. As a particularly bright meteor flared across the dome, a corresponding glyph on the wall brightened in sympathy, and Alara felt a surge of energy pass through the tower, a wave of pure, stellar force that was captured, refined, and directed by the symphony etched in stone. The songs were not just history, they were a living technology, a means of channeling the very energy of the cosmos, a practice kept utterly secret from the rank and file scholars below. The council wasn't just guarding against a threat, they were hoarding an unimaginable source of power. A sudden, heavy footfall on the stone steps of a spiral staircase that wound its way up the wall snapped her from her awe. She was not alone. A sentinel, clad in the silver and blue livery of the tower guard, was making his rounds. There was no time to retreat. Elara threw herself into a deep shadow, cast by a protruding architectural rib, pressing her body flat against the cold stone. The guard's footsteps echoed in the resonant chamber, each one a hammer blow against her composure. She could hear the soft jingle of his mail and the steady rhythm of his breathing as he passed within an arm's reach of her hiding spot. Her heart pounded so violently, she was certain its sound would betray her, a frantic drumbeat against the serene, celestial hum of the tower. She closed her eyes, praying to the silent stars that he would not glance into the niche. For an eternity of seconds, he paused, almost as if sensing a disturbance in the air, before his footsteps resumed, fading as he continued his ascent. The immediate danger had passed, but the tension had wound her nerves like a taut string. Slowly, she emerged from the shadows, her gaze drawn back to the glowing wall. One notation in particular, a complex chord symbol carved at eye level, seemed to pulse with a gentle, inviting light. It was a reckless impulse, born of a need to understand that overrode all caution. What was the feel of this magic? Was it cold? Was it warm? Raising a trembling hand, she reached out and, with the very tip of her finger, traced the elegant curve of the glyph. The moment her skin made contact, the tower responded. A single, pure note chimed through the air, soft as a whisper yet impossibly clear, like a drop of water falling into a perfectly still pond. The sound was not loud, but it resonated through the very stone of the tower, a vibration she felt in her bones. It was an active interaction, a direct communion with the magic she had only theorized about, and the consequence was immediate and terrifying. The soft chime did not fade away. Instead, it hung in the air for a moment before seeming to be absorbed by the wall. Then, with a deep, grating sound of stone on stone that had not been heard in centuries, a section of the wall beside her, seamless just moments before, began to swing inward. The grinding of stone ceased, leaving behind a silence that felt thicker and more profound than any Elara had ever experienced. Beyond the newly opened doorway was not a room, but a pocket of compressed space, a chamber that seemed to exist between the heartbeats of the tower itself. The air was still and carried the dry, clean scent of ozone after a storm, and in the center of this impossible space, seated on a simple stool, before a lectern holding a scroll that glowed with a soft, internal light, was an elf so ancient his skin seemed woven from the same parchment he studied. This was Lyrian, the Keeper of Whispers, a scholar so legendary most believed him to be a myth, a ghost story told to frighten junior archivists into obedience. His eyes, when they lifted from the scroll to meet hers, held not the icy judgment of Fenler, but the weary, deep-seeing gaze of someone who had witnessed the turning of ages. He did not greet her with warmth. Instead, his voice, a dry rustle like autumn leaves, cut through the silence. "You have a talent for breaking things that should remain whole, child. The door was not meant for your hands." He rose, his movements surprisingly fluid for one who appeared so old, and began to circle her, his sharp eyes missing no detail, from the dust on her cloak to the faint, telltale hum of the crystal leaf she had foolishly forgotten to silence. "You trace the chord of alignment, a novice's mistake, or a calculated risk. Tell me, what did you hope to find? A treasure, a source of power to elevate your standing among the petty politicians below?" His questions were not curious. They were a test, a blade probing for weakness or falsehood. This was not a confrontation of authority, but an intellectual duel, and Alara realized her every word would be weighed and measured. She stood her ground, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I was looking for the truth that archivist Fenler tried to bury with my research. I found a crystal leaf in a forgotten alcove. It pulsed in time with the chanting from this tower. I theorized that the forbidden songs are not merely a lock, but a living system, and that your isolation here isn't a punishment, but a duty." She reached into her cloak and drew out the scroll case, offering it to him. It was a gamble of immense proportions, placing her only piece of tangible evidence into the hands of this stranger. But something in his weary eyes spoke of a loneliness that mirrored her own curiosity, a shared exile from the simple certainties of the spire. Lyrian took the case, his long, delicate fingers unwrapping the linen with a reverence that softened the harsh lines of his face. He did not need to remove the leaf. He simply held the case, his eyes closing as he sensed its energy. A sigh, heavy with the weight of centuries, escaped his lips. "The leaf of lament," he whispered. "A key, not a trinket. I had wondered where the council had hidden it." He opened his eyes, and the hostility had been replaced by a grim, reluctant respect. "You are correct, though your understanding is but a single note in a grand symphony. The songs are a containment system, yes, but what they contain is not a monster or a demon. It is a primordial silence, a void that existed before the first note of creation was sung. This silence does not bring peace. It consumes. It devours sound, and then light, and then memory itself. Every story ever told, every song ever sung, every whispered secret of a lover, all would be erased, unwritten from the fabric of existence. We are not jailers of a dangerous beast, child. We are librarians standing guard against the ultimate, final erasure of the library. The revelation struck Elara with a force that was almost physical. This was no longer about challenging a rigid authority or satisfying a personal thirst for knowledge. The dusty scrolls and theoretical arguments in the council chamber vanished from her mind, replaced by a terrifying, cosmic scale of responsibility. The very memory of the world was at risk. Her personal curiosity had inadvertently led her to the precipice of a catastrophe beyond comprehension. The stakes had escalated from the fate of one rebellious scholar to the survival of history itself. Seeing the dawning horror and understanding on her face, Lyrian nodded slowly. Your innate talent is rare, to feel the pulse of the leaf, to find this chamber. The song has chosen you as much as you have chosen it. The current guardians grow old and fearful, reinforcing cages when they should be strengthening the song. They have forgotten that a melody, to remain strong, must sometimes change its key. He looked at her, his expression now one of solemn assessment. The path before you is one of immense burden. Will you bear it? Will you learn to sing, not for glory, but to become a shield for all that is and ever was? Alara's decision was made in the space of a single breath. There was no other choice. Teach me, she said, her voice firm, all trace of hesitation gone. She had found her purpose, and it was vaster and more terrifying than she had ever dreamed. Lyrian gave a curt nod. Then our first lesson begins now. We start with the most difficult discipline, the cultivation of silence. But as he raised a hand to demonstrate, a sharp, metallic clang echoed from the tower chamber beyond the hidden door, followed by the raised voices of the tower guard. Their hiding place had been discovered. The sound of heavy, armored footsteps and the barked orders of the captain, searching for the source of the mysterious chime, severed the moment of revelation, replacing it with the immediate, perilous threat of capture. The sound of armored boots on stone, sharp and purposeful, was closing in. Lyrian's ancient eyes, wide with a sudden, urgent fire, snapped from Elara to the hidden door. There was no time for fear, no moment for questions. The first lesson, he whispered, his voice a thread of sound in the thickening air, is not about song. It is about its absence. To guard the melody, you must first master the silence between the notes. Now, breathe out, not just the air from your lungs, but the sound from your soul. Pull it all back in and hold it. Elara's mind reeled. Silence. She had spent her entire life reaching for sound, for music, for the vibration of meaning in the air. The idea of cultivating its opposite felt like a betrayal of her very nature. It was an internal war, a clash between her instincts and the desperate need of the moment. Yet, as the captain's voice barked an order just beyond the stone slab, she had no choice but to obey. She closed her eyes, trying to follow his impossible instruction. She breathed out, imagining the hum of her own life force, the subtle resonance that every living thing emits, retreating inward. It was like trying to still a rushing river with her bare hands. Her heart was a frantic drum, her pulse a roar in her ears. How could she silence that? Lyrian's hand gently touched her shoulder, and his will flowed into her, not as a command, but as a guide. Do not fight the sound, he murmured, his thoughts blending with hers. Acknowledge it. Then, imagine a sphere around you, a bubble of perfect, pristine stillness. Not a void that destroys, but a lens that focuses. It does not negate the song. It contains it perfectly for a moment. The silence is not your enemy. It is the sheath for your blade. His words reframed the power, transforming it from an act of suppression into one of intense concentration. This wasn't about becoming quiet. It was about becoming so focused, so utterly centered, that her personal noise simply ceased to exist. With this new understanding, Alara tried again. She didn't try to crush the sound of her heartbeat, but instead acknowledged its rhythm, then gently directed her awareness to the space just beyond her skin. She envisioned a delicate, shimmering membrane forming around her, a barrier that absorbed vibration. To her astonishment, the world began to change. The thunderous beat of her heart softened to a distant echo. The scuff of the guard's boots became muffled, as if heard through a heavy blanket. The very air around her grew thick and still. She had done it. She was standing inside a pocket of absolute silence, a sanctuary she had woven from her own will. Peeking through slitted eyes, she saw Lyrian, who had enacted the same technique, giving her a slow, approving nod. The captain and his guards burst into the chamber, their armored forms passing within inches of them, their searching gazes sliding right over the two elves, as if they were mere figments of the shadows. The guards saw nothing, heard nothing, and after a tense minute of fruitless searching, they retreated, their confusion evident in their muttered complaints. The immediate danger had passed. The consequence of this success was profound. Elara had not just hidden, she had performed a magic that was, by the council's decree, utterly forbidden. She had proven her innate aptitude in the most dramatic way possible, saving not only herself, but the legendary keeper of whispers from capture. The act was a line crossed, a point of no return. She was no longer just a curious scholar who asked difficult questions. She was now an active practitioner of the ancient, proscribed arts, a renegade in truth as well as in spirit. Her rift with the main society of the Verdant Spire was no longer a matter of philosophical disagreement. It was a chasm carved by action. The stakes had been permanently raised. As the sound of the retreating guards faded, Lyrian let the sphere of silence dissipate. The normal sounds of the tower rushed back in, feeling almost loud after the profound quiet. He looked at Alara, his expression a mixture of pride and grave concern. "You have a natural gift," he stated, his voice low, "but your successful test comes at a dark hour." The council's suspicion is not solely fixed upon you, child. Their fear is growing because they hear it too. A dissonance, a cracking chord deep within the foundational songs. The containment is not just a historical fact. It is a living, breathing thing, and it is growing weak. They scapegoat you for the noise you made because they are terrified of the true silence that is gathering strength. Your defiance has simply forced into the open a crisis that has been brewing for centuries. Their nightly practices became a secret ritual, a delicate dance of sound and intent, conducted in the profound quiet of Lyrian's hidden chamber. Elara was learning that true power in song lay not in volume, but in precision, in the ability to place a single, perfect note into the tapestry of existence, with the care of a weaver adding a golden thread. On this particular night, they were working on a simple harmony, a foundational exercise meant to teach her how to align her personal resonance with the ambient magic of the spire. Lyrian hummed a steady, low drone, a tone as solid and unchanging as bedrock. Elara's task was to weave a complementary melody around it, a flowing, liquid line of sound that would intertwine with his without ever clashing. For a few moments, it was working beautifully. The combined sound created a warmth in the small chamber, a gentle vibration that felt like the world itself was humming in contentment. Then, without warning, it happened. a sound that was not a sound at all, but a tear in the fabric of reality, ripped through the air. It was a discordant note, a shriek of absolute wrongness that had no place in the scale of creation. It was not loud, but it was violent, a physical force that slammed into them both. Elara cried out, clapping her hands over her ears as a sharp, stabbing pain lanced through her skull. Lyrian staggered back, his face a mask of pained shock. Above them, the crystals embedded in the ceiling, which normally glowed with a soft, steady light, flickered wildly, plunging the room into strobing shadows before flaring back to life. The air itself tasted of ozone and dust, as if something ancient had suddenly crumbled. The immediate, painful consequence was undeniable proof. This was not a scholar's theory or a cryptic warning from a reclusive mentor. This was a tangible, physical event. The containment system that archivist Fenler had spoken of with such grave authority was not just a historical precaution. It was a failing structure, and the cracks were now audibly, painfully apparent. The Council's deepest fear was not a potential future threat. It was a present and escalating catastrophe. Their secrecy, their rigid control over the knowledge of the songs, was not merely an act of hoarding power. It was a desperate attempt to maintain order in the face of a disaster they did not know how to fix. By hiding the truth, they had prevented panic, but they had also prevented any possibility of finding a new solution. The flickering crystals were a symptom of a sickness at the very heart of their world, a sickness Fenler and his followers had been trying to treat with silence and band-aids. In the aching quiet that followed the dissonance, the conflicts facing Elara multiplied and deepened, layering upon one another like storm clouds. The most obvious was her ongoing struggle against the Council, an institutional force that still saw her as a dangerous rogue. But now, that conflict was overshadowed by a far greater one. The collective of scholars, both traditionalist and reformer, against the impending existential disaster. The very survival of their society, and potentially all of existence, was now in the balance, and within Alara herself, a new, more personal battle raged. A cold, primal fear gripped her, the instinct to flee from a danger so vast it was incomprehensible. What could she, a junior scholar with a few weeks of forbidden training, possibly do against a force that could make the stars themselves flicker? This fear wrestled with her burgeoning sense of duty, the responsibility she had accepted when she chose to learn from Lyrian. The weight of the world's memory, which had felt like a noble abstraction days before, now felt like a physical chain around her neck. Watching the last erratic flicker of the crystals stabilize into a fragile, uneasy glow, Elara made her decision. She lowered her hands from her ears, her expression shifting from pain to a hard, determined resolve. "We cannot stay hidden any longer," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor she felt inside. "This secret is a poison. Fenler is trying to hold a crumbling wall together by telling everyone it's perfectly solid. But people are going to get hurt. The entire foundation is giving way. Secrecy is now more dangerous than the truth. We have to go to the Council. We have to show them what is happening. Not as rebels, but as fellow guardians sounding the alarm." Her argument was not born of rebellion, but of a stark, pragmatic assessment of the situation. The time for clandestine lessons and hidden chambers was over. The crisis demanded transparency and collective action, even if it meant walking directly into the lion's den. Lyrian studied her, his ancient eyes filled with a complex mixture of pride and profound worry. He had spent centuries in the shadows, believing isolation was the only way to safeguard the fragile truth. The idea of confronting the council, of which he had once been a member before his self-imposed exile, went against every instinct honed over hundreds of years. To reveal ourselves is to risk everything, he cautioned, his voice a low rumble. Fenler will see it not as a warning, but as an attack, a move to seize power. He will brand us as the cause of the instability, not its messengers. He knew the stubborn pride of his former colleague all too well. Yet, as he looked at the determined set of Elara's jaw and felt the lingering, acidic echo of the cracking chord in the air, he knew she was right. The problem had escalated beyond political maneuvering and doctrinal disputes. The integrity of their world was not just threatened, it was actively, visibly degrading. The stakes were no longer about exile or reputation. They were about the unmaking of reality itself. With a slow, reluctant sigh, he nodded. Very well. There is a place, a tradition. During the full moon, the council holds a private convocation at the moon pool to realign their spirits with the celestial currents. It is their most vulnerable and most sacred gathering. If we are to have any hope of being heard and not merely captured, that is where we must intercept them. The plan was set, a desperate gamble to turn enemies into allies at the edge of a sacred pool, under the cold light of the moon. The journey to the moon pool was a silent, nerve-wracking trek through the spire's most secluded pathways. Lyrian led the way, his movements as fluid and silent as a shadow, while Alara followed, her heart a frantic drum against the stillness of the night. The air grew cooler and carried the clean, mineral scent of water as they approached their destination. The moon pool was not a grand, constructed place, but a natural amphitheater where the earth had opened to cradle a perfectly circular spring. Its surface so still, it looked like a shard of obsidian, reflecting the full moon overhead. Arrayed around its edge were the 7 members of the Council of Quills, their robes glowing faintly in the lunar light. They were deep in a harmonized chant, a low, resonant hum that seemed to draw silver threads of light from the moon down into the water, a ritual of alignment and reinforcement. It was a scene of profound peace and power, a sacred moment that Alara and Lyrian were about to shatter. Stepping out of the tree line into the open space felt like crossing an invisible barrier into a forbidden sanctuary. The chanting faltered as the council members turned, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and pure outrage. Archivist Fenler, standing at the head of the pool, was the first to find his voice. "You dare," he thundered, the word cracking through the ritual's tranquility like a whip. "To profane this sacred ground, seize them." But before the guards stationed at the perimeter could move, Alara took a decisive step forward. She knew they had only one chance to be heard, and it required a demonstration that could not be ignored or dismissed as fantasy. "We are not here to profane anything," she called out, her voice ringing with a confidence she did not fully feel. "We are here to show you the truth you are all afraid to face. The wall is cracking." "Listen." Closing her eyes for a brief moment, she pushed aside her fear and focused on the memory of the painful dissonance in the tower. She did not channel the full, destructive force of it. Instead, she recreated its essence, its fundamental wrongness. She opened her mouth and released a single, sharp, carefully controlled note. It was not loud, but it was utterly alien to the harmony of the night. The sound hit the moonpool's serene energy field like a stone thrown into a still pond. The silvery threads of moonlight flickered and twisted. The water's surface, moments before a perfect mirror, rippled violently as if boiling from within. A wave of palpable discomfort, a psychic nausea, washed over the assembled elves. Several council members recoiled, their hands flying to their ears or their hearts. One, the elder named Lyra, who had shown a flicker of interest during Elara's trial, stared at the disturbed pool with undisguised horror. By the first song, she whispered, her voice trembling. The child speaks the truth. The foundation is shaking. The consequence of this undeniable proof was instantaneous and chaotic. The Council of Quills, the unified governing body of the most learned elves in the world, fractured before Elara's eyes. The chamber was no longer a place of ritual, but a battleground of ideologies. Lyra and two other council members rallied around her, their faces etched with fear, but also a desperate hope. "We have been blind," one of them cried, turning to Fenler. "We have been treating a dying patient with bandages. We must listen to them. They have accessed knowledge we have forgotten." But Fenler's face was a mask of cold, rigid fury. He saw not a warning, but an attack. Not a cry for help, but a coup. "This is not truth," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Alara and Lyrian. "This is sabotage. This is the chaos that comes from defying our laws. They have tampered with forces they do not understand, and now they bring the resulting corruption here, to our most sacred site, to undermine our authority." A fierce, passionate debate erupted, echoing under the moon. The traditionalists, led by Fenler, argued for immediate containment, to silence the renegades, reinforce the old protocols with even greater strength, and double down on secrecy to prevent panic. The reformers, galvanized by the physical evidence of the failing songs, pleaded for a new approach, for collaboration, for using the knowledge Elara and Lyrian possessed to find a real solution. The tension was electric, a storm of words and wounded pride that threatened to tear the very fabric of their society apart. In the midst of this upheaval, Fenler made his decisive choice. His loyalty was not to a potential solution that involved these outcasts. It was to the preservation of order, to the power structure he had dedicated his life to upholding. He drew himself up to his full height, his voice cutting through the din with absolute, final authority. "Enough. Alara and Lyrian are hereby branded renegades and traitors to the Verdant Spire. Their words are poison, their actions a direct threat to our survival. Guards, arrest them, take them to the deep cells." The stakes escalated in a heartbeat. Elara was no longer a disobedient scholar or a clandestine student of forbidden arts. She was an official outlaw, a criminal in the only home she had ever known. The society itself was now openly fractured, with a portion of its leadership siding with the fugitives against their own archivist. As the guards advanced, their spears glinting in the moonlight, Lyrian grabbed Alara's arm. "We cannot fight them here," he hissed, his eyes scanning the tree line. Their only hope was the tangled, mysterious darkness of the whispering woods that bordered the moon pool. With a shared glance of understanding, they turned and ran, plunging into the oppressive shadows of the forest, as the shouts of their pursuers and the fractured arguments of the council faded behind them. The darkness of the Whispering Woods was not a simple absence of light, but a thick, living entity that swallowed sound and sight alike. The moment Alara and Lyrian crossed the tree line, the moonlight vanished, replaced by a canopy so dense it felt like they had been plunged into the depths of a shadowy ocean. Behind them, the shouts of the guards and the furious commands of Archivist Fenler were quickly muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing their pursuit. But it was not a safe silence. It was a listening silence. Every rustle of a leaf underfoot sounded like a thunderclap, and the very air seemed to press in, waiting for them to make a fatal mistake. Elara's heart hammered in her chest, a frantic rhythm that she was certain would betray them. Then she remembered Lyrian's first lesson, the mastery of silence. She forced herself to breathe, to pull the sound of her own panic back inside, to become a quieter note in the forest's symphony. This was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a matter of survival. Lyrian moved with an uncanny grace, his form barely disturbing the undergrowth. "They will use hounds," he whispered, his voice a thread of sound that barely reached her ears. "Hounds that track not by scent, but by the resonance of a living soul. You must mask our trail, not with brute force, but with misdirection. You have felt the echo in the stone of the tower. Now you must teach the air to lie." It was a terrifying, exhilarating challenge. Elara focused her will, pushing her awareness out into the oppressive gloom. She could feel the subtle vibrations of their passage, the crush of a fern, the displacement of air. With a gentle push of intent, she did not erase these sounds, but she duplicated them. She sent a soft echo of their footsteps, branching off to the left, a phantom rustle that moved through the bushes, as if two people were fleeing in that direction. To the right, she created a pocket of distorted sound, a sonic mirage that made the gentle gurgle of a distant stream seem to emanate from a thicket much closer to their actual path. It was a delicate, exhausting act of creation, like painting with invisible ink on a canvas of darkness. The consequences of her successful sonic tapestry were immediate and relieving. From behind them, they heard the baying of the resonance hounds change in tone, becoming confused. The shouts of the guards shifted direction, following the false trail she had woven to the left. For a precious few minutes, the immediate pressure eased, but the victory was bittersweet. With every step deeper into the woods, they were moving further away from the Verdant Spire, from the vast archives, from the community that had been their entire world. They were now cut off, utterly and completely. The knowledge of the Spire, the collective wisdom of millennia, was a locked door behind them. All they had was what was in their minds, and the dangerous, untested lore that Lyrian carried from his centuries of isolation. Their only resources were their wits, and the fragile, growing power of Alara's untrained voice. The chase became a grueling physical trial that tested their endurance to its limits. Thorns, like grasping fingers, snagged at their robes, tearing the fine fabric and scratching their skin. Unseen roots seemed to rise from the ground to trip them, and the uneven terrain was a constant threat to their ankles. The tension was a wire stretched taut in Elara's soul, pulled even tighter by the distant, mournful sound of a hunting horn that echoed through the trees at irregular intervals. It was a sound that spoke of organization and relentless pursuit. Each blast was a reminder that Fenler's reach was long, and his determination to silence them was absolute. They were not just running through a forest, they were being hunted through a labyrinth of shadows, with every sense strained to its limit against the constant threat of discovery. After what felt like hours of frantic flight, Lyrian suddenly stopped in a small clearing where a single beam of moonlight managed to pierce the canopy, illuminating his aged, weary face. He listened intently, not with his ears alone, but with his entire being, sensing the sonic landscape around them. The immediate sounds of pursuit had faded, for now. He turned to Elara, his expression grave. "We cannot run forever, and we cannot hide in these woods indefinitely. Fenler will turn this entire forest inside out to find us. Our only hope now lies not in fleeing from the past, but in seeking a truth that is older than the council itself. I have made a decision." He looked toward the east, where the land began to rise into formidable, mist-shrouded peaks. "I will lead us to the Sanctum of the First Note." It was the original sanctuary of the Song Guardians, a place built by the very elves who first composed the songs of making. It is a place so ancient, its location has been erased from all but the most secret and forgotten scrolls. I doubt even Fenler remembers it exists. This decision was a monumental gamble. They were abandoning the known world for a legend, trading the certain danger of pursuit for the uncertain perils of a myth. The Sanctum was a promise, but it was also a question mark. Would it even still be there? Would its ancient protections still function? Were the secrets it held a solution, or simply a more profound mystery? The stakes escalated once more. They were no longer just fugitives. They were pilgrims on a quest for a forgotten gospel, and their only guide was the fading memory of an elf who had walked the world when those songs were new. They were placing their lives and the fate of the unraveling world in the reliability of ancient lore that had not been tested in centuries. Trusting in Lyrian's memory, they turned their path toward the rising ground, pushing deeper into the wild, uncharted territories beyond the spire's influence. The path Lyrian chose was not a trail, but a relentless upward climb through increasingly rugged terrain, where the air grew thin and cold, and then they began to feel a change in the atmosphere. It started as a faint vibration in the soles of their feet, a hum that traveled up through the rock itself. Soon, the very air around them began to thrum with a low, pervasive power, as if the mountain they were approaching was not made of stone, but of solidified music. The hum of the singing mountain was no longer a distant vibration in the air. It was a physical force that resonated in their bones, a deep, foundational chord that made the very stone beneath their feet feel alive. Lyrian led the way, his steps sure despite the treacherous, moss-slicked path that wound up the mountainside. The air grew thick with moisture, and soon the roar of water filled their ears. They rounded a final, massive boulder, and there it was, a colossal curtain of water, thundering down from a cliff high above into a mist-shrouded pool below. It was a breathtaking sight, but it appeared to be a solid, impassable wall. The stories say the entrance is behind the fall. Lyrian shouted over the din, his eyes scanning the crashing water with a mixture of reverence and uncertainty. But the key is not a physical one. The waterfall itself is the first guardian. It will only part for the correct sequence of notes, the harmonic key of the first guardians. I know the theory, the intervals, but my voice, it has been too long since it held the purity required for such a song. the attempt must be flawless. Elara understood the unspoken request. This was not a task for a single voice, but a duet of perfect trust and alignment. Lyrian possessed the knowledge, the intricate map of the melody in his mind, but the vitality, the clear, untarnished resonance needed to give it physical form, had to come from her. It was a test of their newfound partnership, more than any they had yet faced. Lyrian began to hum the first note, a low, grounding tone that seemed to vibrate in sympathy with the mountain itself. He then sang a series of complex intervals, his voice wavering slightly with age, but holding true to the ancient pattern. Alara listened, her entire being focused on matching not just the pitch, but the intent behind each sound. When it was her turn to add her voice, she did not simply imitate him. She wove her melody around his, strengthening his weaknesses and adding a layer of youthful clarity that gave the ancient key a new power. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The waterfall continued its relentless plunge. Then, a miracle, the roaring water seemed to hesitate. The curtain of liquid began to shimmer, and then, impossibly, it parted down the middle, as if drawn aside by invisible hands, revealing a dark, arched opening in the cliff face behind it. The path was open. Stepping through the veil of water was like crossing a threshold into another age. The roar of the waterfall vanished, replaced by an absolute, profound silence that was somehow more immense than any sound. The air within the sanctum was dry and carried the scent of stone and something else, something clean and electric, like the air after a lightning strike. Light came from the walls themselves, where veins of crystal pulsed with a soft, rhythmic glow, illuminating a vast, circular chamber. And there, arranged on crystalline lecterns that seemed to grow directly from the floor, were the scores. These were not scrolls of parchment or vellum. They were etched onto tablets of polished moonstone, and the musical notations upon them were not simple ink, but seemed to be made of captured light, swirling and moving as if alive. Elara approached the nearest one, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized the structure of the song. It was a foundational containment melody she had studied in a heavily edited form in the Spire's archives. But this version was astronomically more complex. Where the council's score had 4 staves, this one had 12, each representing a different harmonic dimension. The notes were not static. They shimmered and interconnected in a web of such intricate beauty, it made her head spin. The consequence of this discovery was staggering. The council's versions were not just simplified, they were pale, withered shadows of the original power. Over centuries of fearful copying and cautious editing, they had stripped away the song's essential complexity, weakening the very containment they sought to maintain. Their attempts to control the magic had, in fact, been steadily eroding it. Their awe was immediately cut short by a low, resonant hum that filled the chamber. The sanctum was not simply a library, it was a vault actively defended by its creators. A series of floating crystals descended from the shadowy ceiling, each emitting a different, pure tone. To proceed further into the chamber, they had to navigate a path that appeared only when the correct harmonic response was given to each crystal. It was a physical and intellectual challenge of the highest order. One crystal would emit a challenging note, and Lyrian would have to identify its place in the ancient scale, while Elara had to sing the precise counter-harmony to pacify it. A misstep was not met with a simple failure. A discordant reply, caused the crystals to flare with painful light and emit a disorienting wave of sonic force that made their vision blur. At one point, a crystal demanded a harmony so complex it required them to sing it around, their voices overlapping in a precise, interlocking pattern. The tension was immense, a high-stakes puzzle where the penalty for a mistake was potentially being rendered helpless within this sacred, isolated space. Their success depended on a perfect fusion of Lyrian's ancient theoretical knowledge and Alara's innate, practical talent for sound. When they finally reached the central dais, where the most important scores, the songs of making themselves, were displayed, Elara did not hesitate. She turned to Lyrian, her face illuminated by the swirling light of the primordial music. "We can't just take these and run," she insisted, her voice filled with a new kind of authority. "We have to understand them." Fenler feared the power because he never understood its true nature. He saw only the lock, not the treasure it protects. If we are to have any hope of repairing the containment, we need to know what we are actually protecting. We must study the originals. This decision was a pivotal moment. It shifted their goal from mere survival and rebellion to true, deep scholarship. She was advocating for a path of profound understanding, risking precious time they might not have, because she knew that a half-understood solution could be more dangerous than the problem itself. They were no longer fugitives hiding a secret. They were becoming the true inheritors of a legacy that had been lost to fear. The stakes of their discovery escalated to a terrifying new level. By finding the sanctum of the first note, they had not just found a safe haven, they had located the ultimate source, the pure, undiluted wellspring of the world's musical magic. This made them, and the sanctum itself, the single most important strategic objective for any force with an interest in the songs. If Fenler and his traditionalists were to find them, they would seek to reclaim and relock this knowledge, perhaps even destroy it to prevent what they saw as its inherent danger. But even more frightening was the thought of a different, unknown party, discovering the sanctum, someone or something that wished not to contain the primordial silence, but to unleash it. They were now the guardians of a secret that could save the world or unmask it entirely, and they were isolated, with the entire might of a fearful council and the unknown perils of the wider world potentially hunting for the power they now possessed. As Elara carefully unrolled the first of the central scores, the light from the notations danced across her face. She expected to see complex instructions on weaving silence, on building walls of sound. But as she began to decipher the flowing, luminous script, she realized with a shock that washed over her like a wave that the song was not about containment at all, not in the way Fenler had described. It was a record, it was a memory. The notes described not the building of a prison, but the moment of creation itself, the first light, the first breath of wind, the first drop of rain. The songs didn't just cage the silence, they were the living library of everything the silence sought to erase. The luminous notations on the Moonstone score seemed to pulse in time with Elara's own heartbeat. This was not a song in the way she understood it, a sequence of notes arranged for a purpose. The symbols swirled and interconnected, depicting a flow of energy, a story written in the language of creation itself. Lyrian had warned her that the song of making was not to be sung lightly, that its power was not for shaping, but for remembering. but a theoretical warning could not prepare her for the reality. Driven by an insatiable need to understand the true nature of the legacy she now touched, she chose a single, seemingly simple phrase from the beginning of the score. She took a steadying breath, focused her will, and gave the notation voice. The sound that left her lips was unlike any she had ever produced. It was not loud, but it was impossibly dense, a note that contained multitudes. For a single, terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the world dissolved. It was not an explosion, but an implosion of consciousness. The Sanctum, Lyrian, the very stone beneath her feet, all of it vanished, washed away in a torrent of pure experience that was not her own. She was no longer Elara, a single elf in a hidden cave. She was the first drop of rain striking barren stone, feeling the immense patience of erosion over millennia. She was the silent, determined push of a root through dark soil, the sensation of sunlight on the first new leaf of the first forest. She felt the joyous, chaotic rush of a river carving its path through a newborn valley, the coolness of the water and the grit of the sediment not as concepts, but as physical memories imprinted on her soul. She witnessed the birth of mountains in cataclysmic upheavals of fire and rock, and felt the deep, slow peace that settled over them ages later. These were not visions or dreams. They were ancestral memories, the lived experiences of the world itself, preserved within the very fabric of the song. The weight of it was immense, a pressure on her spirit that threatened to snuff out her individual identity entirely. She was a single candle flame, trying to contain the light of 1,000 suns. When the connection finally severed, it was not a gentle release, but a violent snapping back into her own body. She stumbled backward, gasping for air as if she had been drowning, her hands flying to her temples. The flood of memories receded, but it left a permanent watermark on her soul. The consequence of this direct contact was a shift in understanding so profound it felt like a second birth. Archivist Fenler had spoken of the songs as a lock, a necessary containment for a dangerous silence. Lyrian had refined that to a shield against oblivion. But now Alara knew the truth with a certainty that eclipsed all argument. The songs were not merely a defensive barrier. They were the library. They were the living record. Every moment of beauty, every struggle for life, every quiet dawn and raging storm since the beginning of time was encoded within these harmonies. The loss of the songs would not just be a catastrophic event. It would be the ultimate act of forgetting. It would be the erasure of the world's autobiography. The stakes were no longer about saving a society or even preventing a disaster. They were about preserving the very memory of existence, ensuring that the story of a river's flow or a forest's growth was not replaced by an eternal, silent blank page. This revelation ignited an internal conflict more terrifying than any confrontation with the council. The intellectual curiosity that had driven her to hum a forbidden melody in the archives now felt like a childish whim. The responsibility was a crushing weight. How could she, a being who had lived only a fraction of a single verse in this epic poem, possibly presume to be a guardian of the entire library? The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, whispering that she was inadequate, that the burden would break her, that it was arrogance to think she could carry such a legacy. This personal dread wrestled with the overwhelming, empathetic connection she now felt to every leaf, every stone, every ripple of water. She had not just learned about creation, she had felt it. To turn away from this duty would be a betrayal of that intimate, painful, beautiful knowledge. In the profound silence of the sanctum, broken only by her ragged breathing and Lyrian's worried gaze, Elara made her decision. She slowly lowered her hands, and when she looked up, the fear in her eyes had been forged into a steely resolve. "It is not enough to mend the crack," she said, her voice hushed but firm, echoing slightly in the vast chamber. "I cannot simply learn the songs as a tool to fix a problem. I must understand them. I must become a vessel for this memory, the title of guardian. It cannot be about control, as Fenler believes. It must be about stewardship. It is a promise to remember. This was no longer a mission assigned or a path chosen out of defiance. It was a calling accepted. The mission had become deeply, irrevocably personal. She was no longer just trying to save her society from a threat. She was committing herself to becoming a living link in the chain of history, a guardian of the world's soul. This newfound resolve, hard-won and fragile, was tested almost immediately. A sharp, distinct sound from beyond the sanctum's entrance shattered the introspection, the unmistakable clatter of a loose stone falling, followed by a quickly stifled gasp. Lyrian moved with startling speed, extinguishing the glow of the central crystals with a swift gesture, plunging them into near darkness. Peering through the shimmering veil of the waterfall, now turned into a one-way mirror by the difference in light, they saw a figure crouched on the opposite bank of the misty pool. It was a young elf, clad in the practical leathers of a scout from the Verdant Spire's perimeter guard. He was not one of Fenler's fanatical enforcers, but his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and triumph as he stared directly at the previously hidden entrance. Their sanctuary was breached. The council's search had reached the Singing Mountain. The silence in the sanctum became a weapon, sharp and heavy, as the three figures stood frozen in the dim, pulsating light. Lyrian's hand was on Elara's arm, a silent warning against any sudden move. The scout, Kalin, had been pulled swiftly through the waterfall, his initial cry of surprise cut short as he found himself surrounded by the impossible, humming chamber. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than Alara, his face a mask of shock that quickly hardened into a desperate defiance. He held his hands up, not in surrender, but in a fighter's stance, his eyes darting between the legendary renegade and the young scholar he had been sent to hunt. "Do it then," he spat, his voice trembling with a bravado that didn't reach his eyes. "I will not be silenced easily." Elara, however, did not advance. She saw the fear beneath his bluster, the rigid certainty of someone who had been told he was pursuing villains. He expected violence, threats, the dark magic the council had warned him about. To meet that expectation would only confirm every lie he'd been fed. Instead, she slowly lowered her own hands, making a subtle gesture for Lyrian to do the same. The tension was a taut wire in the air, a quiet standoff where the next word could snap it. "We are not your enemies, Kalin," she said, her voice calm and measured, cutting through the humid air. "And we are not here to silence anyone. The council has done enough of that for all of us." He stared at her, confusion warring with his training. "You desecrated the moon pool. You broke our most sacred laws. Archivist Fenler said you seek to unravel the world itself." His words were a recitation, a lesson learned by rote. "That is what he believes," Elara replied, not with anger, but with a profound sadness. "But what if he is wrong? What if the real danger isn't our curiosity, but his fear? She took a slow step back, not toward him, but toward one of the glowing moonstone lecterns. You have been taught that these songs are a cage for a monster. But what if I told you they are not a cage at all? What if they are a story? This was her gamble. Force had failed the council. Secrecy had brought them to the brink of disaster. The only weapon left was the unvarnished, undeniable truth. She did not command him to look. She simply turned her back to him, a gesture of immense vulnerability, and faced the central score. She began to hum, not a complex spell or a powerful working, but a simple, haunting melody from the Song of Making, the same phrase that had overwhelmed her with the memory of the first rain. As the sound filled the sanctum, the crystalline veins in the walls brightened in sympathy, and the luminous notations on the stone swirled with renewed life. Then she did something even Lyrian had not anticipated. She channeled a sliver of the memory, not into herself, but outward, projecting it into the air between them. A shimmering image appeared, not a solid illusion, but a ghostly tapestry of light and sensation. The sight of a vast, empty sky, the feeling of immense anticipation, and then the pure, clean scent of the first rainfall on warm, barren stone. Kalin's defiant stance crumbled. His hands lowered slowly as he watched, his jaw slack with awe. He wasn't seeing a weapon or a destructive force. He was witnessing a birth. The propaganda of a dangerous, locked-away power evaporated in the face of such profound, innocent beauty. What is this?" he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "This is what they have been hiding," Elara said softly, letting the image fade. "This is the true song. It doesn't contain a silence that destroys. It contains the memory of everything that silence would erase. The first rain, the first sunrise, the first leaf on the first tree. The council's versions are weak copies, fading echoes. They have been guarding a dying fire by building a wall around it, when what it needed was air and fuel." She turned to face him fully, her eyes earnest. "The dissonance you felt, the cracking chord, it is not our doing. It is the sound of the wall crumbling. The story is starting to be forgotten, Kalin, and Fenler's only solution is to build a higher wall." The consequences of this revelation played out across the young scout's face in real time. The certainty he had carried from the spire shattered, leaving behind a turbulent sea of conflict. He had dedicated his life to the service of the council, believing in the righteousness of their mission. Now the foundation of that belief had been pulled out from under him. He looked from the ancient, weary face of Lyrian, a figure from children's tales who stood before him as a fugitive, to Alara, whose passion and sincerity shone with a light far brighter than the fear Fenler had preached. His loyalty, once an unshakable pillar, was now cracked and shaking. Elara watched this internal struggle, knowing the next decision was the most critical of all. She could hold him here, a prisoner to ensure their secret safety. She could try to force him to their side, but coercion would only create a slave, not an ally. True change had to come from within. She made the risky, almost foolish choice to trust him. "We will not keep you here, Kalin," she declared, her voice clear and firm. "You are free to go." Lyrian stirred, a sharp intake of breath his only protest. Elara pressed on, her gaze locked with the scouts. "Return to the spire. Tell Fenler whatever you must to stay safe. but carry what you have seen here with you. You know the truth now. The decision of what to do with it is yours alone. It was a gamble of breathtaking proportions. He could run straight to Fenler, leading the entire guard directly to their hidden sanctuary. Their safe haven would become a tomb. Or he could become a seed of doubt planted deep within the heart of their enemy, a potential ally who could sway others from the inside. The stakes could not be higher. They were betting their lives and the fate of the world's memory on the conscience of a single, confused young elf. Kalin looked at the waterfall, then back at the glowing scores, his expression a whirlwind of emotions. He gave a slow, hesitant nod, unable to find words. He turned and with one last, awestruck glance at the sanctum, pushed back through the curtain of water and was gone. The moment he disappeared, the tension in the chamber did not lift. It simply changed form. Lyrian stepped closer to Elara, his voice low and grave. That was a brave gesture, child, perhaps even a noble one. But you have just handed a map to our only sanctuary, to a soldier who, an hour ago, would have gladly arrested us. You gamble on his heart, but you underestimate the power of fear and indoctrination. Fenler did not gain his position through open-mindedness. He will not be swayed by the testimony of one shaken scout. He will see this only as confirmation of our manipulation, and he will act with even greater force. The path of truth had been chosen, but the shadow of the archivist's stubborn resolve now loomed larger and darker than ever before. Back in the sterile, ordered silence of the Verdant Spire's central observatory, Archivist Fenler stared into a scrying pool that showed not the stars above, but the singing mountain. The water's surface, usually calm, was troubled with faint, discordant ripples, echoes of the powerful, unfamiliar harmonies now emanating from within the stone. The scout Kalin's report had not been one of triumph, but of confusion and awe. He spoke of memories made of light and the scent of the first rain. To Fenler, these were not beautiful truths. They were the most dangerous kind of heresy. It was not the blunt force of an attack he feared, but the seductive, corrupting power of a different truth. Control, the rigid, disciplined control that had safeguarded their world for millennia, was slipping through his fingers. The renegades were not just hiding, they were preaching, and their gospel threatened to unravel the very hierarchy that gave his life meaning. Fear, cold and sharp, crystallized into a desperate resolve. If they would not be contained by reason or by force, they would be silenced by the very power they claimed to champion. He would build a cage of quiet around the mountain, severing the sanctum from the symphony of the world. He gathered the most loyal members of the council, those who still saw the world in stark contrasts of order and chaos. In the Starfall tower, where Alara had first traced the glowing notation, they began a new ritual, one of severance rather than connection. Instead of channeling celestial energy to reinforce the ancient songs, they inverted the flow. Fenler, his voice a low, grim counterpoint to the tower's natural hum, began to weave a ward of profound silence. It was a meticulous, draining working, like weaving a net made of anti-sound. Thread by psychic thread, they stretched this net around the singing mountain, aiming to smother its innate music, to isolate it as a surgeon isolates a diseased limb. The consequence of this aggressive act was immediate and visceral. High on the mountain, the gentle, ever-present hum that had been a comfort to Alara and Lyrian began to falter. The vibrant harmonies that resonated through the rock softened, as if someone were slowly turning down the volume of the world. The air, once charged with potential, grew thick and heavy, becoming difficult to breathe. The cheerful chirping of the high-altitude birds ceased abruptly, and the wind itself seemed to lose its voice, moving through the pines in an unnervingly soundless whisper. The environment itself was turning against them, the mountain's lifeblood being choked off by Fenler's fear. Inside the sanctum, the change was even more alarming. The luminous notations on the moonstone scores began to dim, their gentle pulsing growing sluggish. The crystal veins in the walls, which had glowed with such steady power, flickered like guttering candles. The conflict was no longer a distant political struggle or a future catastrophe. It was a race against time happening in the very air they breathed. The oppressive stillness was a physical weight, pressing down on their thoughts, making it hard to focus, hard to even remember the melodies they had been studying. The tension was palpable, a silent scream building in the atmosphere. They were not just trapped, they were being erased from the inside out, their sanctuary becoming a tomb of quiet. Lyrian's face was ashen, a silencing ward, he rasped, his voice sounding strangely loud and fragile in the dead air. Fenler is trying to cut the mountain off from the world's song. He is starving the sanctum. If he succeeds, the connection will be permanently severed. The knowledge here will become inert, locked away forever behind a wall of silence we cannot penetrate. And without the mountain's natural power to bolster it, the failing containment elsewhere will accelerate into a freefall. Faced with this existential threat, the instinctive response would be to fight force with force, to gather their power and try to shout down the silence, to blast a hole in Fenler's ward. But Alara, still carrying the visceral memory of the world's birth within her, understood the flaw in that approach. A direct assault would be like trying to extinguish a fire by pouring gunpowder on it. It would only confirm Fenler's belief that their power was chaotic and destructive. It would be a battle of wills that would likely shatter the fragile sanctum in the process. She closed her eyes, pushing back against the oppressive stillness, and reached for the mountain's fading song with her spirit, not her voice. She felt its struggle, its innate desire to resonate, to be part of the great symphony. No, she said, her decision cutting through the gloom. We cannot break his ward. That would only create more noise, more discord. We must remind the mountain how to sing. We have to amplify its own native song, to strengthen it from within, so that it can push back against the silence. It is the only way that doesn't destroy what we're trying to save. It was a subtle, infinitely more difficult approach, akin to nursing a guttering flame back to life, rather than striking a new, brighter spark. It required empathy and precision, not brute strength. The stakes of this quiet battle escalated to a terrifying new height. If Fenler's gambit succeeded, it would mean more than just their capture. The sanctum of the first note, with its pure, unaltered songs, would be lost, perhaps for another 1,000 years, if it could ever be found again. The world would be left with only the Council's weakened, failing versions of the melodies, ensuring the eventual collapse of the containment. Fenler, in his desperate attempt to maintain control, would inadvertently become the architect of the very oblivion he sought to prevent. Their failure would mean the end of any hope for a true solution. Lyrian nodded slowly, a glimmer of respect in his weary eyes. To amplify a song of such age and power, a mere voice is not enough. We need a focus, a lens to concentrate the mountain's own spirit. We need an artifact of pure, undiluted sound. His gaze grew distant, searching the vast archives of his memory. There is one, from the earliest days, when the first guardians worked in harmony with the spire, a harp, carved from the heartwood of the first singing tree, and strung with filaments of solidified starlight. It is called Eloria, but it is not here. After the schism, when the guardians grew secretive and fearful, it was locked away. It resides now in the deepest, most heavily warded vault beneath the Verdant Spire itself. The irony was bitter. The very tool they needed to save the legacy of the first guardians was held captive by the descendants who had forgotten its true purpose. The oppressive silence pressed in around them, a tangible weight that made every breath an effort. The air in the sanctum, once vibrant with the hum of ancient power, was now dead and heavy, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath under the strain of Fenler's silencing ward. The luminous notations on the moonstone scores had dimmed to a faint, sickly glow, and the rhythmic pulse of the crystal veins in the walls had slowed to a faltering, irregular beat. Time was running out. Lyrian's suggestion hung in the stifling air. The harp Eloria, an artifact of pure sound, was their only hope, but it was locked in the heart of their enemy's stronghold, a world away. A direct assault was impossible. They were trapped. It was then that Alara remembered a principle she had only ever read about in theoretical treatises, a concept so delicate and demanding that few scholars ever attempted it, the law of sympathetic vibration. The idea that two objects, tuned to the same essential frequency, could communicate across any distance, resonating as one. It was a long shot, a thread of hope thinner than a spider's silk, but it was the only thread they had. She selected a small, clear crystal from a niche in the sanctum wall, one that had been bathed in the mountain's song for centuries and still held a faint echo of its power. Cradling it in her palms, she closed her eyes, shutting out the terrifying stillness. She had to find the unique harmonic signature of Eloria, a frequency she had never heard, using only Lyrian's description of the harp's origin, carved from the first singing tree, strung with solidified starlight. It was like trying to describe a color she had never seen. She began to sing, not a melody, but a single, pure note, holding it steady while she used her will to subtly alter its quality, searching for a resonance. The effort was immense and instantly draining. It was not like projecting sound to create an illusion or a sphere of silence. This was an act of profound listening and precise emission, a sonic needle she was trying to thread across miles of silent, warded space. A fine tremor started in her hands, and a bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. The slightest miscalculation, a note too sharp or too flat, would not simply fail. The energy she was pouring into the crystal would have nowhere to go, rebounding back in a concussive wave that could shatter the crystal and lash her mind with the backlash. Worse, such a violent release of mismatched energy would be a flare in the silent landscape, instantly alerting Fenler to their exact method and location. As the strain intensified, threatening to break her concentration, Elara realized her own voice was not enough. The Sanctum's power was fading, and her personal strength was a tiny spark against the vast, smothering silence. She needed a greater source. Remembering the flood of ancestral memories from the Song of Making, she made a daring decision. Instead of fighting the weight of the past, she would invite it in. She opened her mind, not to be overwhelmed, but to draw upon the Sanctum's stored memories as a power source. She focused on the memory of the first wind, feeling its clean, wild energy. She channeled the patient strength of the first stone. She let the joy of the first rivers flow, fill her spirit. These were not her memories, but they were part of the song she was trying to save. By aligning her purpose with the very essence of the world's history, she became a conduit for something far larger than herself. Her voice, amplified by eons of stored experience, gained a new depth and authority. The single note she sang into the crystal no longer sounded frail. It became profound, layered with the whispers of creation itself. Miles away, deep in the bedrock beneath the Verdant Spire, the air in the highest security vault was always still and cold. The artifact known as Eloria rested on a velvet cushion inside a crystal case, untouched for centuries, a beautiful relic considered too potent and unpredictable for use. As Alara's voice, supercharged by the memory of the world, found its perfect sympathetic frequency, a miracle occurred. The harp began to glow with a soft, internal light. Then, a low, clear hum emanated from its star metal strings, a sound that had not been heard in generations. The vibration grew, not loud, but pervasive, making the crystal case shiver and the very stone of the vault thrum in response. The two guards stationed outside the vault door started, exchanging bewildered glances. One pressed his ear to the cold metal, his eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" He whispered, "It sounds like singing." The artifact they had been taught was a dormant, dangerous treasure was now awake and answering a call from a source they could not comprehend, creating a pocket of defiant music at the very core of Fenler's domain. The stakes of this desperate, remote attempt could not have been higher. Alara and Lyrian were betting everything on a theory and a thread of sound. If this failed, if the connection could not be made or was broken, the silencing ward would complete its work. The Sanctum would be permanently sealed, its knowledge entombed within a mountain that had been rendered mute. They would be trapped inside a silent grave, and the world outside would be left to face the unraveling of memory, with only the failing, weakened songs of a fearful council. Their only hope was now a ghost of a chance, a vibration traveling through a medium they could not see, reliant on a tool they could not touch. The humming of the harp was a beacon, but it was a beacon that also signaled their activity to anyone nearby. As the guards outside the vault debated what to do, their confusion was observed by another. Kalin, the young scout, had been avoiding the main thoroughfares, his mind still reeling from what he had witnessed in the mountain. The strange, beautiful music coming from the supposedly silent vault stopped him in his tracks. He saw the guards' uncertainty, their hesitation to report something so inexplicable. In that moment of confusion, he saw not a problem, but an opportunity. The artifact was awake, and if it was awake, it could be moved. The low, resonant hum emanating from the vault door was a sound that did not belong. It was a vibration that felt more like a memory than a noise, a thread of pure music weaving itself through the sterile, silent corridors of the spire's lower levels. For Kalin, who had been moving through the shadows like a ghost, the sound was a lifeline. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall, watching the two guards stationed outside the artifact vault. Their postures, usually rigid with discipline, were now slack with confusion. They were whispering, their heads close together, casting nervous glances at the sealed door as if it had suddenly grown teeth. Elara's words echoed in his mind, not as a memory, but as a living presence. What if the real danger isn't our curiosity, but his fear? He had replayed the scene in the Sanctum 100 times since his return. The ghostly image of the first rain, the profound sadness in Elara's eyes, the terrifying weight of the truth she carried. The Council's teachings, once the bedrock of his reality, now felt like a fragile cage of lies. Archivist Fenler had spoken of dangerous power that needed to be controlled, but the power Kalin had witnessed was not destructive. It was foundational, beautiful, and desperately needed. The dissonant crack that had shaken the moon pool was not the work of renegades. It was the sound of Fenler's control shattering. The conflict within him, a turbulent storm of duty versus truth, finally quieted into a single, clear note of resolution. His loyalty was not to an archivist or a set of rules. It was to the spire itself, to the memory of the world that the spire was meant to protect, and that memory was dying. He had to act, but how does one steal a heavily guarded, legendary artifact from the most secure vault in the stronghold of one's own people? The answer lay not in force, but in misdirection, in using the very fear Fenler had instilled against him. Taking a deep breath, Kalin reached for the one advantage he had, his knowledge of the guard rotations and the architecture of the lower levels. Just around the corner was a secondary storage chamber for unused ritual components, including several casks of refined glow moss powder, a substance used for creating luminous paints. It was also, when dispersed in the air, highly irritating to the eyes and lungs. It was a childish trick, a prank played by junior scribes, but it would have to serve as a weapon of war. Moving with a speed born of desperation, he slipped into the storage chamber. He found a small clay pot of the fine powder, and, using his belt knife, he carefully pried the lid loose. Then he crept to a ventilation shaft that fed air toward the vault corridor. With a silent prayer to any spirit that might be listening, he poured the entire contents of the pot into the shaft. A cloud of faintly glowing, greenish dust billowed into the confined space and was immediately carried by the gentle current of air toward the two guards. Within seconds, he heard the first cough, followed by a choked curse. "What in the world? My eyes," one guard sputtered, rubbing at his face. The other was doubled over, hacking uncontrollably as the abrasive powder filled the air. This was his moment. While the guards were blinded and disoriented, Kalin darted from his hiding place. He didn't have the key to the vault, but he knew its weakness. The crystal case inside was not opened by a physical key, but by a specific harmonic sequence, a secret known only to the Council. But Alara had already unlocked it from a distance. The hum was proof. He placed his hands on the cold metal of the vault door and pushed, not with his muscles, but with his will, focusing on the sympathetic vibration, on joining the song that was already happening. To his astonishment, the complex locking mechanism, designed to resist any physical force, responded to the harmonic key. With a deep, resonant click that was felt more than heard, the massive door swung inward just enough for him to slip through. The inside of the vault was breathtakingly simple. In the center, on a pedestal, rested Eloria. The harp was smaller than he had imagined, its wood the color of twilight, and its strings seemed to be spun from captured starlight, shimmering with an internal music. The hum was emanating from it, a warm, welcoming vibration that felt like a hand extended in friendship. He did not hesitate. He strode forward, his earlier fear replaced by a sense of profound rightness. As his fingers closed around the smooth, warm wood of the harp's frame, the hum intensified for a moment, a joyful recognition, and then settled into a soft, steady thrum against his chest. He had it. The key was in his hands. The consequence of this action was immediate and absolute. By touching the harp, by removing it from its sanctioned resting place, Kalin had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer a scout of the Verdant Spire. He was a thief, a traitor, a fugitive. The weight of the artifact in his arms was nothing compared to the weight of the choice he had just made. He had severed his ties to the only life he had ever known, betting everything on the word of a renegade scholar and the truth of a memory made of light. He was now irrevocably aligned with Elara's cause, a partner in her desperate quest. Slipping back out of the vault, he saw the two guards still struggling with the effects of the glow moss, their vision blurred by tears. He moved past them like a whisper, clutching the harp close. He had to get out of the spire, and he had to do it now. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. Every echo of a distant footstep sounded like a pursuing guard. The tension was a wire stretched taut in his soul. He expected at any moment to hear the alarm bell, to see a squad of enforcers blocking his path. He used every trick of stealth he knew, taking service passages and forgotten stairways, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the gentle thrum of the harp. His flight was not just a physical escape. It was a race against the moment Fenler would be informed, the moment the full might of the council would be unleashed upon him. He burst from a side entrance into the cool night air, the forest a dark promise of shelter ahead. He did not look back. With the singing mountain as his compass and the hope of a saved world as his fuel, Kalin plunged into the darkness, the precious harp his only companion. Behind him, in the now silent vault, the discovery of the theft would send a shockwave of pure fury through the spire. An archivist Fenler, his worst fears confirmed, would give the order that would set the most skilled and ruthless hunters on their trail. The moment Kalin's feet left the manicured paths of the spire's grounds and hit the wild, root-tangled earth of the forest, the nature of his flight changed entirely. He was no longer a scout, slipping through familiar corridors. He was prey running through a domain of shadows and sharp teeth. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp soil, was filled with the distant, chilling sound he had dreaded, the clear, sharp calls of hunting horns, echoing from different points behind him. They were not just following, they were coordinating, weaving a net of sound to corner him. The harp Eloria, clutched tightly against his chest, felt less like a treasure and more like a beacon. Its gentle hum, a signal he feared would lead his pursuers straight to him. Every rustle in the undergrowth was a potential enforcer, every snap of a twig a heart-stopping alarm. The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled taut in his chest with every frantic beat of his heart. It was in this state of near panic that he first felt the harp's magic not as a passive vibration, but as an active guide. As he scrambled up a steep, rocky incline, his boots slipping on loose scree, a low, thorny thicket blocked his path, its branches seeming to clutch at him with malicious intent. Breathing heavily, he pressed forward, and the harp, jostled against his body, emitted a soft, unintended chord. The sound was not loud, but it was profoundly calming, a wave of tranquility that washed over the aggressive plants. To his astonishment, the thorny branches didn't retreat. They simply relaxed. Their sharp points seemed to soften, and they swayed gently aside, creating a narrow, passable gap. It wasn't a command, it was a request, a harmonic plea that the wilderness itself chose to honor. Later, when he stumbled into a patch of ground that was little more of a sucking, treacherous bog, a different, deeper note resonated from the strings as he struggled. The mud beneath his feet seemed to firm, the water pulling back just enough to give him solid purchase for a few critical steps. The artifact was not a weapon to dominate the terrain, but a key that harmonized with it, asking the mountain itself for safe passage. This subtle assistance was the only thing that kept him ahead of the enforcers, who, armed with force and fury, would have to fight the land for every inch they gained. The chase was a brutal test of endurance and wit. Kalin used every trick he had learned as a perimeter scout, doubling back on his trail, wading through icy streams to mask his scent, and climbing high into the rocky crags where the footing was treacherous, but the sight lines were clear. From one such vantage point, his lungs burning with the thin, cold air, he saw them, 5 figures moving with the grim, relentless efficiency of Fenler's personal guard. They were not running, they were flowing over the obstacles, a wave of focused intent that was steadily closing the distance. They were perhaps only 10 minutes behind him now. The sight sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him, extinguishing his fatigue. He pushed on, his muscles screaming in protest, the sound of the waterfall that shielded the Sanctum growing from a distant murmur to a thunderous roar in his ears. It was a race he was barely winning. The path narrowed dramatically, clinging to the side of a sheer cliff face. Below, a river churned violently over jagged rocks. Ahead, the way forward was spanned by a natural arch of ancient, milky blue ice, a bridge formed over centuries by frozen spray from the waterfall. It was his only route. As he set foot on the translucent surface, he heard a shout from behind. The lead enforcer had reached the cliff path and had seen him. There was no more time for stealth or subtlety. They would be on him before he could reach the other side. In that moment of absolute crisis, faced with the certain failure of his mission, Kalin made a desperate decision. He could not fight them, but he could change the battlefield. He stopped in the center of the fragile ice bridge, the enforcers advancing quickly, their weapons drawn. He raised the harp, not with the skill of a musician, but with the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping a rope. He did not play a complex melody. He focused all his will, all his fear, all his hope into a single, perfect intention, safety, and he plucked one string. The note that rang out was so pure, so clear, it seemed to freeze the very air. It was a sound of absolute cold and absolute stillness. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a web of hairline fractures erupted from the point where his foot touched the ice. The cracks spread with impossible speed, racing across the arch with a sound like 1,000 windows shattering at once. The lead enforcer, only steps away from grabbing him, lunged forward, but it was too late. With a final, groaning roar, the center of the ice bridge gave way, collapsing into the raging river far below. The enforcers were forced to scramble back onto solid ground, cut off from their prey. Kalin, on the now isolated section of the bridge closest to the waterfall, did not wait to see their fury. The consequences of his action were immediate and twofold. He had bought himself the precious seconds he needed, but he had also revealed his ultimate destination. There was no doubt now in the enforcers' minds where he was going. The secret of the waterfall was blown. The final confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and it would happen at the Sanctum's doorstep. Without a second glance back at the furious shouts from the opposite bank, Kalin turned and ran the final few yards along the crumbling ice ledge. The mist from the colossal waterfall soaked him instantly, and the roar was deafening, a physical pressure that pushed against him. He could see the solid wall of water ahead, and for a terrifying moment, he thought of the stories, that it would only part for a song. He had no time for a song. He had only momentum and a desperate, final leap of faith. Clutching the humming harp to his chest, he closed his eyes and plunged directly into the thundering curtain of water, expecting to be dashed against the unyielding stone of the cliff behind it. Instead, he felt a sudden, shocking silence and a sensation of passing through a cool, yielding membrane. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees on smooth, dry stone, the roar of the waterfall now a muffled backdrop. As he looked up, gasping for breath, he saw Elara and Lyrian staring at him in stunned relief. But that relief lasted only a moment, because through the shimmering veil of water, now acting as a murky window, they could all see the dark, determined shapes of the enforcers gathering on the opposite bank, already assessing the gorge, preparing to find another way across. He had reached Sanctuary, but he had brought the storm with him. The sight of Kalin stumbling through the waterfall, gasping for breath and clutching the glowing harp, was a moment of pure, disbelieving relief. Elara and Lyrian rushed forward, pulling him fully into the Sanctum's protective embrace just as the young scout's legs gave way. The moment his feet left the threshold and the Eloria harp crossed into the chamber, an immediate and profound transformation occurred. It was not an explosion, but an expansion. The oppressive, smothering silence that had been strangling the mountain shattered like thin glass. The combined resonance of Alara's innate connection, the Sanctum's ancient power, and the pure, undiluted song of the harp merged into a single, triumphant chord that erupted from the mountain's core. It was a crescendo of sound that was also a wave of light and life, rushing outwards in a visible ripple of restored energy. The crystal veins in the walls blazed with a brilliance they had not known for centuries, and the humming of the stone returned, stronger and more joyful than ever before. High in the Verdant Spire, Archivist Fenler, still channeling the last threads of his silencing ward, was thrown backward by a psychic backlash as his carefully woven net of quiet was torn to shreds by the raw, uncontained power of the first song. His plan had not just failed, it had been utterly annihilated, and the proof echoed through the souls of every elf in the spire. For a single, precious heartbeat, there was only elation inside the Sanctum. Elara helped Kalin to his feet, a smile of shared victory breaking across her face. They had done it. They had the harp, the Sanctum was awake, and the mountain was singing again. But the celebration was brutally short-lived. Through the shimmering curtain of the waterfall, now acting as a distorted window to the outside world, they saw the consequences of their victory take shape. On the opposite bank of the misty pool, the enforcers had not been deterred by the collapse of the ice bridge. Instead of retreating, they were regrouping with a grim efficiency that spoke of unwavering resolve. More figures emerged from the trees, reinforcing the original squad. They were not just guards, they were Fenler's most loyal, fanatical in their belief, that the renegades were a cancer that had to be cut out. They began assembling makeshift grappling hooks and ropes, their intentions clear. They would cross the gorge and assault the waterfall entrance directly. The brief moment of relief curdled into a new, more immediate tension. They were safe, but they were also cornered. The Sanctum, their sanctuary, was about to become a fortress under siege. Faced with the imminent threat of a violent invasion, the trio had to make a critical decision instantly. Flight was impossible. The only exit was the entrance about to be stormed. Surrender was unthinkable. It would mean the end of their quest and the loss of the world's memory to Fenler's fear. That left only one option. We make our stand here, Elara declared, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her throat. Lyrian nodded, his ancient eyes scanning the chamber's architecture with a newfound focus. The Sanctum is more than a library, he said. Its builders were not fools. They designed it to be defended, not with blades and arrows, but with the very essence of what we protect. The stakes of this decision were absolute. This was a last stand in the truest sense. If the enforcers breached the chamber, they would not be taken prisoner. They would be silenced permanently, and the sacred scores would be either destroyed or locked away forever under a seal of absolute secrecy. The fate of the ancient songs and the memories they held rested entirely on their ability to hold this single, sacred room. As the first grappling hook flew through the air, its metal claws catching on the rocks beside the waterfall with a grim finality, Lyrian turned to Alara and Kalin, his expression grave. The ultimate defense of this place was never meant to harm the body, he explained quickly. It was designed to challenge the spirit. The Sanctum can project the memories it holds not as simple pictures, but as fully immersive illusions that speak directly to the heart and mind of those who enter with hostile intent. We can show them not what we are, but why we are here. We can fight them with the very history they have been ordered to erase. The concept was both terrifying and brilliant. This would not be a battle of force, but a war of perception, a desperate attempt to win the souls of their enemies by showing them the beautiful, fragile truth they were attacking. The enforcers began to rappel down into the gorge, their dark forms moving with lethal purpose against the roaring white water below. The assault on the Sanctum of the First Note had begun. The first of the enforcers burst through the waterfall, their silver and blue armor glistening with mist, their faces set in masks of grim determination. They expected a physical fight, blades against staves, a clear and honorable clash of force. What they found was something far more disorienting. Alara and Lyrian stood back to back in the center of the chamber, not with weapons raised, but with their hands open at their sides. Their voices rose, not in a war chant, but in a complex, interwoven harmony that seemed to pull the very light from the glowing walls. The air in the Sanctum thickened, shimmering like a heat haze, and then the illusions bloomed into being. It was not a battle of echoes in the sense of mere sound. It was a war of shared experience, a direct assault on the spirit. The initial wave of projections was defensive, born of Lyrian's centuries of guarded knowledge. He summoned memories of primordial terrors that even the ancient scrolls only hinted at the soul-chilling shriek of a shadow wraith from the world's first long night, the ground-shaking tremor of a behemoth whose passing had carved entire valleys. These were not monsters of fantasy. They were ancestral fears, etched into the Elven psyche so deeply that the enforcers reacted not with tactical discipline, but with primal, gut-wrenching horror. One soldier dropped his sword, clutching his ears as the psychic scream of the wraith tore through his mind. Another stumbled backward, his eyes wide with a terror that belonged to a species memory older than his own life. The air grew cold, and the scent of ancient, frozen stone filled the chamber, making the confrontation feel as if it were happening at the dawn of time. The enforcers' formation, so perfect moments before, dissolved into a chaotic scramble of individuals fighting personal demons only they could see. Seeing the raw panic and despair on their faces, Elara knew that terror alone would not win this fight. It might break their advance, but it would only cement their belief that the power within the Sanctum was a corrupting evil to be destroyed. To save the songs, she had to save the souls of those sent to silence them. She made a conscious choice, shifting the tone of the harmonic tapestry she and Lyrian were weaving. She reached into the vast library of memories contained within the Song of Making and began to project a different kind of truth. Alongside the fading echo of the ancient beast, she wove the heartbreakingly tender memory of the first Elven bond mates saying goodbye, not knowing if they would survive the coming winter. Their whispered promises carried on a wind that smelled of snow and pine. She showed them the radiant joy of a mastercraft elf seeing his finished creation catch the light for the first time, a moment of pure, unadulterated pride. She filled the air with the simple, profound melody of a lullaby sung by a mother to her child under a canopy of stars that no longer existed, a memory so universal it resonated in every heart present. The effect was surreal and deeply unsettling for the attackers. One moment, a soldier would be cowering from a monstrous roar, and the next, he would be blinking back tears as the ghostly image of a lost, loved one smiled at him. The conflict became an internal, emotional whiplash. A young enforcer, his hand tight on his weapon, suddenly found himself surrounded by the vivid memory of the forest where he had played as a child. The dappled sunlight and the smell of warm earth so real he could almost feel it. The memory was one of perfect safety and innocence, a stark contrast to the violent mission he was on. His aggressive stance faltered, his knuckles whitening not with rage, but with confusion. The beautiful memories did not feel like an attack. They felt like a homecoming to a place he had forgotten, a poignant reminder of exactly what he was fighting to protect, or perhaps to destroy. The tension in the room was no longer about physical survival, but about the very definition of their purpose. What were they truly defending? A set of rigid laws, or the living, breathing beauty of those laws were meant to preserve? The strategy began to work, but its success was fragile and uneven. The emotional onslaught proved too much for some. One by one, several of the enforcers lowered their weapons, their faces etched with a dawning horror of a different kind. The horror of realizing they might be on the wrong side of a sacred duty. They looked at their hands, at their blades, and then at the swirling tapestry of light and memory around them, and the fight simply drained out of them. They did not surrender. They simply ceased to be combatants, becoming instead ashamed and awestruck witnesses to a truth they had never been allowed to see. But the heart of the problem remained. Captain Valen, the leader of the enforcers, weathered the psychic storm with the stoic resilience of a deeply rooted oak in a hurricane. While his men were swayed by fear and nostalgia, his fanatical loyalty to archivist Fenler and his conception of order acted as an unbreakable shield. He acknowledged the illusions not as truths, but as sophisticated deceptions, a sorcerous trick designed to weaken their resolve. As his soldiers faltered around him, his resolve only hardened. He saw their hesitation not as a moral awakening, but as a failure of discipline, a contamination that had to be purged. With a roar of pure defiance that cut through the spectral symphony, he slammed the pommel of his sword against his breastplate, creating a sharp, discordant clang that was a sound of the present, a sound of war. "Do not listen to their lies," he bellowed, his voice raw with conviction. "This is chaos disguised as beauty. It is a poison for the mind. Hold fast." And with that, he began to push forward, step by determined step. His eyes locked not on the terrifying beasts or the beautiful ghosts, but solely on Alara. He breached the inner chamber, stepping past his own bewildered men, a solitary figure of unwavering conviction, advancing into the heart of the storm. The battle for the souls of his soldiers was over for now, but the final, direct confrontation with their leader had just begun. Captain Valen stood before them, a monolith of unwavering conviction in the swirling chaos of the Sanctum. While his men were shaken by the phantoms of primal fears and poignant memories, he remained untouched, his loyalty to Archivist, Fenler a suit of armor that no emotional illusion could penetrate. He had breached the inner chamber, not with a triumphant charge, but with a grim, deliberate pace, his sword held not in a threat, but as a symbol of the rigid order he was sworn to uphold. His eyes, hard and clear, ignored the spectral tapestry around him and fixed solely on Elara. The conflict was no longer a battle against a squad. It had narrowed into a personal, direct duel of wills, a fundamental clash between two irreconcilable interpretations of duty. "You weave a pretty dream," Valen stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the lingering echoes of the lullaby. He did not shout. His power came from an unshakable certainty that made his words land with the weight of absolute truth. "You show us beauty and terror and call it truth, but I see only chaos. I see the careful structure of our society, the discipline that has kept this world safe for 1,000 years, being pulled apart thread by your reckless curiosity." He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping from Elara to Lyrian, and then to the glowing scores. "Fenler warned us. He said you would not rest until you had unraveled the very fabric of our reality, and here you are, using the world's oldest magic as a plaything for your arguments. Your actions have sown dissent among my own soldiers. You have turned guardians against their oath. This is not protection. This is the path to destruction." Elara felt the force of his argument like a physical blow. He was not a villain. He was a patriot, a guardian who truly believed that the only way to preserve the whole was to enforce absolute control over its parts. To him, her quest for understanding was the highest form of arrogance, a dangerous gamble with stakes she could not possibly comprehend. The tension in the room was no longer about magic or might, but about philosophy. It was the age-old struggle between the safety of the cage and the perilous freedom of the sky. Knowing that another magical demonstration would only reinforce his belief in her recklessness, Alara made a critical decision. She lowered her hands, making her posture open and non-threatening. She would not fight him with power, but with the very thing he accused her of undermining, truth. Captain Valen, she began, her voice calm but filled with a passion that came from the depths of her soul. You speak of order, you speak of safety. But I ask you, what is the order for what are we keeping safe? She gestured to the shimmering air around them, where the ghost of the first forest was only just fading. Is it the rule of law itself that we protect, or is it the things those laws were created to safeguard? The memory of a mother's lullaby, the courage of the first explorers, the simple joy of a sunrise. These are not pretty dreams. They are the reason our society exists. They are the foundation upon which all your laws were built. She took a step toward him, her eyes pleading not for her life, but for his understanding. Archivist Fenler's control is a wall he has built around a dying fire, afraid that any breeze will extinguish it. But a fire needs air to live. By hiding the truth, by weakening the songs out of fear, he is not protecting the flame, he is suffocating it. The dissonance we all felt, the cracking chord, that is the sound of the wall crumbling because the fire inside is starving. The choice before you is not between order and chaos. It is between a control that leads to silence and a trust that leads to a stronger, more vibrant song. What truly deserves your loyalty? Captain, the hand that builds the cage, or the living, breathing memory of everything that cage is meant to contain? Valen stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched. For the first time, a flicker of something other than absolute certainty crossed his features. It was not doubt, but a moment of profound hesitation. Elara's words had not broken his armor, but they had found a hairline crack. He was a soldier, a man of action, who believed in clear lines and defined duties. Her appeal to a higher, more abstract purpose challenged the very core of his identity. The immediate outcome of the battle, the fate of the 3 renegades and the sacred Sanctum, hung entirely on the internal struggle now raging behind his eyes. Would he hold fast to the duty he knew, or would he dare to redefine it? In that suspended moment of silence, as Valen's conviction wavered on a knife's edge, the decision was ripped from everyone's hands. A sound tore through the sanctum that dwarfed all previous dissonance. It was not a crack, but a rupture, a catastrophic snap that was felt rather than heard, a wave of pure wrongness that originated from a great distance, yet struck with the force of a physical blow. The very floor beneath them shuddered. The luminous notations on the moonstone scores flared with a violent, sickly light before dimming to a flicker. The air itself seemed to thin, and for a heart-stopping second, the vibrant colors of the crystal veins in the walls drained away to a dull, lifeless gray. The main containment at the Verdant Spire, strained beyond its limits by the Council's weakened songs and the backlash of the failed silencing ward, had critically failed. The theoretical threat was now a visceral, global catastrophe. The world did not end with a roar, but with a whisper of forgetting. The catastrophic rupture in the containment spell sent a silent, invisible shockwave across the land, and its effects were immediate and horrifyingly gentle. Outside the sanctum, the vibrant purple and gold flowers that clung to the rocks near the waterfall began to lose their pigment, their colors seeping away like dye in rainwater until they were faded, ghostly versions of themselves. More terrifying than the silence was the sound of the waterfall itself. Its mighty, constant roar began to stutter, fading in and out like a distant radio signal being lost to static. For a few seconds, the thunderous plunge would be deafening, and then it would drop to a mere sigh, as if the very concept of crashing water was becoming difficult for the world to remember. This was not an attack, it was an unmaking. The theoretical threat they had debated, the abstract danger Fenler had warned against, was now a visceral, unfolding catastrophe that touched the air they breathed and the stone beneath their feet. The primordial silence was not a monster knocking down the door. It was an eraser, patiently wiping the world away, line by beautiful line. In the face of this absolute, shared peril, every previous conflict inside the Sanctum evaporated. The ideological duel between Elara and Captain Valen, the tension between renegade and guardian, became instantly, profoundly trivial. The internal struggle that had defined their encounter was replaced by a unified, external threat that made their squabbles look like arguments over the arrangement of deck chairs on a sinking ship. Valen did not lower his sword because Alara had won the debate. He lowered it because the ground itself seemed to become less solid under his boots. He watched, his stern face etched with a dawning, awful comprehension, as the color leached from the world outside the waterfall, and he heard the faltering rhythm of the cascade. The rigid structure of duty and orders that had been the foundation of his entire life crumbled in an instant, because the reality that structure was built to protect was actively dissolving around him. His loyalty was, and had always been, to preservation. In that moment, he realized with sickening clarity that Archivist Fenler's path did not lead to preservation. It led to this hollow, fading silence. The true enemy was not the girl before him, but the oblivion that was making the waterfall forget how to roar. The stakes of their mission escalated from dire to absolute. This was no longer about reforming a scholarly society or proving a point. It was not even about saving their own lives. The entire world was beginning to forget itself, and if the process continued, there would soon be no one left to remember that there had ever been anything to forget. The memories of the first rain, the first sunrise, the bond of the first friends, all of it was poised to vanish into a final, eternal quiet. The very concept of history was under threat. Elara felt the weight of this not as a crushing burden, but as a terrifying clarity. There was no more room for doubt, no more space for fear. The path forward was singular and starkly obvious. She looked from Valen's ashen face to Lyrian's grim expression, and she knew half-measures and hidden sanctuaries were finished. The fractured containment could not be patched from the edges. Only the source would do, the complete, original song of making, uncorrupted by generations of fear and simplification, had to be sung at the very heart of the power. It was meant to sustain the central chamber of the Verdant Spire itself. It was the only force potent enough to reweave the unraveling tapestry of existence, to remind the world of its own name. There was no triumphant battle cry, no declaration of war. The procession that left the singing mountain and moved through the whispering woods was something far more solemn, a quiet pilgrimage of reclaimed purpose. Elara walked at the front, not as a commander but as a guide, with Lyrian and a now resolute Kalin at her side. Behind them followed Captain Valen and his former enforcers, their silver and blue armor no longer a symbol of pursuit, but of a redirected oath. They were not an army marching to conquer. They were a gathering of guardians, scholars, and soldiers, united by a shared, terrifying vision of a world forgetting its own face. Their return to the Verdant Spire was not an assault, but an act of profound responsibility a collective decision to face the source of the decay rather than hide from its consequences. As they moved from the deep wilds toward the more cultivated lands surrounding the spire, the abstract horror of the failing containment became a tangible, chilling reality. They encountered small groups of elves farmers tending to groves, travelers on the road who were not panicking, but were deeply confused and afraid. One woman, her hands stained with berry juice, looked up at them with vacant eyes, unable to recall the name of the fruit she had just picked. An elder, sitting by the roadside, hummed a fragment of a melody over and over, growing increasingly agitated as he could not remember the next note, the tune that had been a comfort to him since childhood. The air in these pockets felt thin and brittle, as if the very substance of the world was becoming insubstantial. Colors were less vibrant, sounds were muffled. It was a subtle fading, a quiet theft of essence that was somehow more frightening than a violent cataclysm. The conflict was no longer with the council, but with the creeping evidence of their failure, a silent emergency that was now impossible for anyone to ignore. Seeing the fear in the eyes of her people, Alara knew they could not simply march past this suffering. A direct, frantic rush to the spire might save time, but it would abandon the very souls they were racing to save to a tide of confusion. She made a critical decision. As they walked, she began to sing. It was not one of the grand, complex songs of making from the Sanctum, whose power was too vast and specific for this purpose. Instead, she chose a simple, ancient melody known to every elf, a folk tune often sung to children, a song about the steadfastness of the stars and the returning light of dawn. She did not sing it to command or to change reality, but to remind it. She poured her will into the notes, focusing on the concept of stability, of things remaining as they are. The effect was immediate, yet gentle. Where her voice traveled, the washed-out colors of the wildflowers by the path seemed to deepen, regaining a hint of their true hue. The muffled sound of the wind in the leaves regained a crispness, a clarity that had been missing. It was a temporary patch, a sonic bandage applied to a bleeding world, but it gave the frightened elves they passed a moment of lucidity, a fleeting anchor in the dissolving present. Her song became a beacon of momentary sanity, a thread of remembered reality woven through the unraveling tapestry. This act of communal reinforcement came at a great cost. Each note required immense concentration, a constant pulling of her own spirit to bolster the fading world around them. The strain was visible on her face. This was a different kind of effort than the explosive power she had channeled in the Sanctum. This was a slow, steady drain, a deliberate spending of her own vitality to keep the lights on for just a little longer. The stakes of their march escalated with every step. They were no longer just racing against Fenler or the Council's guards. They were racing against the total collapse of memory and sound itself. Every moment of delay, however compassionate, brought the entire world closer to a silent, gray oblivion. The pressure was a constant, silent scream in the back of every mind in the procession, a shared understanding that they were walking a razor's edge between salvation and an unmaking so complete it would leave no one to mourn. When the 7 graceful towers of the Verdant Spire finally came into view, piercing the strangely pale sky, they found not a fortress preparing for a siege, but a place gripped by a quiet, bewildered despair. The great gates stood open and unguarded. Elves moved through the courtyards with slow, aimless steps, their faces blank with a confusion too deep for panic. The grand library, usually buzzing with scholarly energy, was silent. The crisis had reached the heart of Elven knowledge, and the rigid structures of authority had crumbled under its weight. The procession moved unchallenged through the familiar halls, their footsteps echoing in a silence that felt heavier than any they had known in the wild. The final obstacle was not a battalion of soldiers, but the ghost of the society they had once known. They moved directly to the central chamber, the source of the spire's power, the place where the council had once performed its grandest workings. Pushing open the immense carved doors, they found the vast circular room almost empty, and there, alone in the center of the chamber, was Archivist Fenler. He was on his knees, his hands pressed against the central crystal focus of the floor, his body trembling with the effort of channeling his own fading life force into the crumbling web of songs. He was not a tyrant defending his throne, but a desperate, broken guardian trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands, his power waning with every faltering beat of his heart. The figure kneeling at the center of the vast chamber was a ghost of the formidable archivist who had once presided over the Council of Quills. Fenler's robes, once immaculate, were now disheveled and dust-stained. His shoulders, usually held with unyielding authority, were slumped in absolute exhaustion. The air around him crackled with the faint, erratic energy of his desperate effort, a dying ember trying to rekindle a fire that had already gone out. He was not defending a throne or preparing for a final, defiant battle. He was simply trying to hold the pieces of a shattered world together with his own trembling hands, and he was failing. As the group entered, he slowly lifted his head, and the look in his eyes was not one of fury or challenge, but of a profound, soul-crushing despair. He saw not enemies, but witnesses to his ultimate failure. The final obstacle in their path was not a wall of force or a legion of guards. It was the tragic, broken figure of a guardian who had loved his duty so fiercely that his fear of losing it had blinded him to the truth. The consequences of this moment were heavier than any sword stroke could ever be. This was not a confrontation to be won through strength or cleverness. It was a moment that demanded a healing of the spirit, a mending of the very schism that had torn their society apart. The tension in the air was thick and sorrowful, an emotional gulf that felt wider than the chasm beneath the singing mountain. Elara felt the weight of every past accusation, every moment of fear and defiance, pressing down on her. To attack Fenler now, even with words, would be to destroy the last chance for their people. The true conflict was no longer between rebel and ruler, but between the corrosive power of pride and the redemptive power of grace. She had to find a way to reach the elf beneath the title, to speak to the scholar who had dedicated his life to preservation, not the archivist who had become a prisoner of his own control. Seeing the utter defeat in his posture, Alara understood that the Eloria harp, the artifact they had risked everything to obtain, could not be a trophy of their victory. It had to become a bridge. She walked forward slowly, her footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous room. The others held back, understanding that this was a dialogue that required only two voices. Fenler watched her approach, his expression unreadable, a mask of weary resignation. He expected condemnation, a final listing of his mistakes. Instead, Alara stopped a few paces from him and did something that defied every expectation. She gently lifted the harp, its wood glowing with a soft, steady light, and she held it out to him not as a challenge, but as an offering. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, yet it carried through the chamber with a clarity that cut through the hum of dying magic. Archivist, she said, the title spoken not with sarcasm, but with respect for the office he had held. Your knowledge is greater than any of ours. Your strength, even now, is what has kept this chamber from collapsing entirely. We cannot do this without you. The song needs every voice. It needs yours most of all. Will you help us? Will you add your strength to ours? This decision was the ultimate test of everything Elara had learned on her journey. It was a choice of radical forgiveness over righteous victory, of unity over vindication. She was offering the symbol of their rebellion, the very object he had sought to suppress, back into his hands, trusting that the guardian in him was stronger than the fearful ruler. The stakes of this single gesture could not have been higher. If Fenler, in his shame and broken pride, refused her offer, if he saw it as pity, or, worse, an insult, then the last vestige of the old guard's power and knowledge would be lost. The song of making would be attempted without the deep, institutional understanding that only he possessed, a potentially fatal flaw in a working of such immense complexity. His refusal would mean not just his own spiritual death, but likely the failure of their last, desperate attempt to save reality itself. The fate of every memory, every story, every color and sound hung on the choice of a broken old elf. Fenler stared at the offered harp, his face a landscape of conflicting emotions. Centuries of rigid belief warred with the undeniable evidence of his own senses. The fading world, the failure of his methods, the sincere, unguarded plea in the eyes of the young scholar he had cast out. He saw not a triumphant rebel, but a weary successor offering him a chance at redemption. The internal struggle was visible in the tremor that ran through his hands and the slow, painful closing of his eyes. It was the struggle of a lifetime of control, finally surrendering to a greater need. When he opened his eyes again, the hard, flinty pride was gone, replaced by a raw, vulnerable humility. With hands that shook not from weakness, but from the enormity of the moment, he reached out and gently took the harp from her. The instrument seemed to sigh as his fingers made contact, its light pulsing warmly, as if welcoming home a lost part of itself. He did not speak. Words were beyond him, but he met Alara's gaze and gave a single, solemn nod, his acceptance a silent pact that healed the rift between past and present, fear and faith. He was with them. A profound silence fell over the great chamber, a stillness that felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then Elara began to sing. It was not a loud sound, not a commanding declaration, but a single, clear note that seemed to originate from the very center of her being. It was the first note of the song of making, the pure, unaltered melody from the moonstone scores in the Sanctum. For a moment, it hung alone in the air, a fragile thread of sound against the overwhelming quiet. Then, a second voice joined it, not from a throat, but from the strings of the Eloria harp. Archivist Fenler, his hands no longer trembling, drew his fingers across the filaments of solidified starlight. The note he produced was ancient and weary, yet perfectly in tune, weaving around Alara's voice like a long-lost companion finding its way home. Their eyes met across the crystal focus of the floor, and in that look passed an entire history of conflict, fear, and now, a shared, desperate hope. This was no longer a solo performance or a secret ritual. It was a duet of reconciliation, the first true harmony the Spire had heard in centuries. The consequence of their joined voices was immediate and visible. The song, now a complex, interwoven tapestry of voice and harp, did not simply travel through the air, it pulsed through the stone of the spire itself. A wave of soft, golden light emanated from the central chamber, flowing outwards through the arched doorways and down the silent corridors. Where the light touched, the fading world remembered itself. The muted gray stone of the walls flushed with the warm, vibrant hues of living rock. The tapestries, which had seemed like faded ghosts moments before, bloomed with restored color, their intricate patterns sharp and clear once more. Outside the chamber, the confused elves in the courtyards looked up as the pale sky deepened to a brilliant azure, and the stuttering, hesitant sounds of the world, the wind, the distant water, the chirp of a bird, snapped back into a steady, confident chorus. It was not an explosion of magic, but a gentle, pervasive healing, as if a great, weary sigh of relief was passing through all of creation. But this restoration came at a terrible, personal cost. The effort required to channel the song of making was not a matter of skill alone. It was an expenditure of spirit. Elara felt each note drawing not just on her breath, but on her very life force. It was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with her own body. Her knees threatened to buckle, and a cold sweat broke out on her brow, yet her voice never wavered. Beside her, Fenler's face was a mask of strain, his aged frame shaking with the effort of matching the song's primordial power. The strings of the harp seemed to bite into his fingers, each pluck requiring a monumental act of will. The conflict was no longer external. It was a brutal internal war against their own physical limitations. The tension was a tightrope stretched over an abyss of failure, with every passing second demanding more from them than they were certain they could give. They were not merely singers, they were conduits, and the power flowing through them threatened to burn them out from the inside. In the midst of this immense strain, Alara made a conscious decision that transformed the nature of the song. She understood that simply replicating the ancient notes from the Sanctum was not enough. That was a restoration, but not a renewal. The original song had been pure, but it was a song of a world newborn. Their world was ancient, scarred, and beautiful in its complexity. So, as she sang, she did not empty her mind. Instead, she opened her heart and let her entire journey flow into the melody. She wove the memory of her lonely defiance in the archives, the thrill of discovering the crystal leaf, the terrifying beauty of the ancestral memories, the solid trust she had found in Lyrian and Kalin, and even the profound, redemptive sorrow of Fenler's surrender. She was not just singing a spell, she was weaving the living history of their struggle, their failures, and their hopes directly into the foundational music of reality. The song became richer, deeper, more resilient, because it now contained the truth of their experience. The stakes of this act escalated far beyond the immediate repair of the frayed world. They were not just fixing a broken containment spell, they were actively refounding the entire purpose of the Song Guardians. The old order, built on secrecy, fear, and rigid control, was being washed away by this new, inclusive harmony. The song was no longer a weapon to be locked away, or a burden to be borne by a fearful few. It was becoming a legacy to be shared, a story to be told, a strength born from unity. This was the birth of a new covenant between the elves and the memory of their world, one built not on obedience, but on understanding, courage, and the collective will to remember. The fate of every past, present, and future moment depended on this single, audacious act of recreation. As the song swelled towards its ultimate climax, building into a crescendo that vibrated in the bones of every elf in the spire, a final, perfect symmetry revealed itself. A soft, warm light began to glow from within the folds of Elara's robe. She reached into her pocket and drew out the crystal leaf, the leaf of lament, the very first clue that had started her on this path. It was no longer just a crystal. It was blazing with an internal fire, its veins of captured moonlight shining with an intensity that rivaled the stars. It pulsed in perfect time with the harmony she and Fenler were creating, no longer a silent key to a forgotten door, but a resonant witness to a promise fulfilled. The leaf's lonely, hidden song was finally answered by the full chorus of the world it had helped to save, its purpose completed in the glorious, healing harmony that now filled the universe. The final, resonant note of the song of making did not simply fade away into the air of the great chamber. Instead, it seemed to settle into the very stone of the Verdant Spire, seeping deep into its foundations like a gentle, penetrating rain after a long drought. The new network of containment that solidified was not a wall or a cage rebuilt from the shattered pieces of the old one. It was something entirely different, something alive. It was a web of interwoven harmonies, a tapestry of sound, where every elf who had heard the song, from the highest archivist to the most junior scribe in the courtyard, became a single, strengthening thread. The power was no longer concentrated in a secret ritual performed by a fearful few. It was distributed, shared, made resilient by the sheer number of voices now consciously connected to it. The silence that followed was not the dead, smothering quiet they had fought against, but a profound and peaceful stillness, the kind that follows a great storm when the air is clean and the world feels newborn. It was a silence filled not with absence, but with potential, heavy with the exhaustion of their ordeal and the luminous, fragile weight of hope. As the brilliant, healing light that had flowed from the chamber receded, the world that was revealed was not merely restored. It was enhanced, as if a film of dust had been washed from a masterpiece, revealing colors more vibrant and details more sharp than anyone could remember. The greens of the ivy climbing the spire's inner walls were a deeper, richer emerald. The song of a single sparrow outside a window sounded with a crystalline clarity that brought unexpected tears to the eyes. It was as if reality itself, having been pulled back from the brink of oblivion, now glowed with a renewed gratitude for its own existence. The immediate, terrifying crisis had been averted, but the consequence of their victory was a world that demanded to be experienced with fresh senses, a world whose beauty was a constant, gentle reminder of how close it had come to being lost forever. In the center of the chamber, the physical and magical tension that had sustained Alara and archivist Fenler snapped. The immense effort of channeling the primordial song left them both trembling, their strength utterly spent. Elara's legs gave way, and she sank to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Fenler, still holding the Eloria harp, slumped forward, his forehead resting against its warm wood. There were no words of celebration, no declarations of victory. There was only the shared, bone-deep weariness of survivors, Lyrian and Kalin moved to their sides, not with cheers, but with quiet, supportive hands, offering water and a steadying presence. The conflict was over, and in its wake lay a vast, quiet space that needed to be filled with something new, something better than the fear and suspicion that had come before. After a time, as a soft, genuine light from a now clear sky began to stream through the high windows, the four of them sat together on the steps of the central dais. The silence between them was comfortable, thoughtful. It was Lyrian, the ancient keeper who had seen empires of thought rise and fall, who finally spoke, his voice a soft rasp. A lock can be broken, a wall can crumble, but a song, when it is sung by many, only grows stronger. The old way, the path of secrets and rigid control, died here today. It cannot be resurrected, nor should it be. Alara looked from his wise, weathered face to Fenler's, which was lined with a new humility. The knowledge cannot be a chain that binds us to fear, she said softly. It must become a thread that connects us to each other and to the world we protect. Fenler nodded slowly, the gesture carrying the weight of a lifetime of beliefs being consciously laid down. The Council of Quills is dissolved, he stated, not with regret, but with finality. In its place, we must build an open order, a community not of gatekeepers, but of teachers. The songs belong to every elf willing to listen with a respectful heart. Our duty is not to hoard the light, but to ensure it is passed on, so that the darkness can never again find such a foothold. This pact, made not with grand ceremony, but with quiet, determined words between exhausted allies, was the true foundation of their new world. It was a decision to replace hierarchy with community, and secrecy with shared stewardship. The stakes of this rebirth were, in their own way, as high as those of the battle they had just fought. They were not fighting for survival anymore, but for the soul of their future. A society built on fear, even a successful one, carries the seeds of its own destruction. A society built on shared responsibility and open knowledge was an untested experiment, fragile and requiring constant care. The escalation was from a physical threat to a philosophical challenge. Could they, as a people, handle the profound responsibility of this power without the old structures of control? Could they trust each other and themselves to be guardians rather than masters? The success of their new foundation would be measured not in spells cast or enemies defeated, but in the wisdom and harmony of generations to come. In the days that followed, a quiet transformation swept through the Verdant Spire. The great doors, once symbolically closed to all but the elite, remained open, and they came, not in a rushed, fearful crowd, but in a steady, hopeful stream. Elves from every discipline and walk of life found their way to the central chamber. A master gardener came, curious about the song she had felt that made her roses bloom with an impossible fragrance. A stonemason arrived, having felt a new strength in the granite he was shaping. Young apprentices sat wide-eyed on the floor, not being lectured, but being invited to simply listen to the faint, ever-present hum of the spire, to feel the vibration of the world they were now part of protecting. The air, once thick with the dust of ancient secrets and unspoken rules, was now filled with the gentle murmur of questions, the sharing of insights, and the first, hesitant notes of new learners finding their voice within the great symphony. It was a sound more beautiful and more powerful than any magic they had ever known. The first light of dawn had never seemed to hold so much promise as it did on the morning the silence was truly broken. It did not happen in a hidden sanctum or a sealed council chamber, but under the open sky in the main courtyard of the Verdant Spire. The air, still carrying the fresh, clean scent of a world recently remembered, seemed to hum with anticipation. They came not by command, but by a shared, unspoken calling hundreds of elves, from the eldest masters whose faces were maps of long years of study, to the youngest children who clutched their parents' hands with wide, curious eyes. They filled the courtyard, a quiet, expectant sea of faces, all turned toward the central fountain, where Elara stood. She was not raised on a platform, not separated from them by rank or title. She stood among them, a simple figure in a plain robe, the only sign of her journey the faint, knowing smile on her face, and the gentle, ever-present light of the crystal leaf she wore on a cord around her neck. She did not begin with a speech about duty or the grave importance of their task. She simply raised her hands, not in a gesture of authority, but of invitation, as if gathering the very sunlight itself. "Listen," she said, her voice carrying easily in the hushed space. "Listen to the breath in your lungs, to the beat of your heart. That is your first song. The melody I will share is simply an extension of that. It is a song of gratitude for the ground beneath our feet and the air we share." And then she began to sing. It was not one of the complex, world-shaking harmonies from the Moonstone scores. This was a simple, beautiful melody, a folk tune, so ancient its origins were lost to time, yet so pure it felt as fresh as the morning dew. It was a song about a seed pushing through the soil, reaching for the sun, a metaphor for the new beginning they were all experiencing together. At first, only a few voices joined hers, tentative and soft, like the first few drops of rain after a drought. But as the melody wove its way through the courtyard, something magical began to happen. A master archivist, who had spent a lifetime whispering over dusty texts, found his voice rising with a strength he had forgotten. A young apprentice, who had only ever known the Spire as a place of strict rules and quiet corridors, sang out with a clear, joyful tone that made her heart swell. The song grew, voice by voice, until the entire courtyard was filled with a single, unified harmony. It was not a perfect, polished performance. There were missed notes and hesitant entries. But its imperfection was its greatest strength. This was not a ritual to be performed flawlessly by an elite few. It was a living, breathing sound, a collective expression of a people rediscovering their own voice. The consequence was profound and immediate. The songs, for so long locked away in fear, were no longer hidden artifacts. They became the fabric of daily life, woven into the very air of the Spire. With every voice added, the melody seemed to gain substance, strengthening the world not through some grand, distant magic, but through the simple, cumulative power of shared experience. Amidst this rising tide of collective joy, a subtle, gentle tension hummed beneath the surface, a feeling Alara knew all too well. It was the fragility of a new beginning, the unspoken worry that this hard-won harmony might be as fleeting as a soap bubble, beautiful but easily broken. Could this trust last? Would old habits of secrecy and control eventually reassert themselves? She saw the flicker of this concern in the eyes of some of the older scholars, a hesitation in their singing that spoke of deeply ingrained caution. But then she would see a child, singing with eyes closed and face turned to the sun, completely lost in the moment, and the worry would dissolve. The collective joy, the sheer, palpable relief of singing together without fear, became a force more powerful than any lingering doubt. It was a celebration that actively reinforced the very unity it expressed, creating its own momentum. As the chorus reached a particularly lovely crescendo, a natural pause in the melody occurred. It was the moment a conductor would traditionally step forward to guide the next movement. Every eye turned to Elara, expecting direction, waiting for their leader to show them the way. This was the critical decision she had known was coming. She smiled, but instead of raising her hands to command, she let them fall to her sides. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. The way the melody wants to breathe on its own now. It does not need a single voice to guide it. It needs all of ours, listening to each other. This chorus has no single leader. Its strength is in its unity. By consciously stepping back from the position of authority they were offering her, she made the most powerful choice of all. She was not refusing to lead. She was redefining leadership itself. It was not about being the source of the song, but about being a guardian of the space where everyone could sing. She was ensuring that the responsibility for the songs, and for the world's memory they preserved, was distributed among every single voice present. The future of this new way was secured not by concentrating power, but by sharing it, making the entire community the guardian of its own legacy. The chorus, understanding her intent, did not falter. Instead, it found a new strength. Without a central director, the elves began to listen more intently to each other. The melody swelled again, richer and more organic than before, as different voices gently rose and fell, supporting one another in a beautiful, self-sustaining harmony. It was the sound of a society learning to trust itself. As Alara stood within this ocean of sound, a profound sense of peace settled over her. The mission was accomplished. The songs were safe, but just as this thought solidified, a familiar sensation, a curious pull at the edge of her perception, made her subtly shift her attention. It was not a sound one could hear with the ears, but a harmonic pattern felt in the spirit, a faint, elusive melody that seemed to echo from a great distance, carried on a wind from the uncharted, mist-shrouded forests far to the east. It was a whisper of a song she had never heard before, and it tugged at her curiosity with the same gentle, insistent force that had once drawn her to hum a forbidden tune in a silent archive. The great chorus in the courtyard eventually softened, not ending but dissolving into a contented, humming quiet, as if the spire itself was savoring the echo of so many joined voices. In the days and weeks that followed, a new rhythm settled over the Verdant Spire, one of shared purpose and open discovery. Elara found herself not at the head of a council, but in the center of a constantly shifting circle of learners and teachers. She would spend her mornings with the youngest novices, helping them feel the vibration of their own breath as the first instrument, and her afternoons in deep discussion with former archivists like Fenler, who now approached the ancient scores with the wonder of beginners, their fear replaced by a genuine thirst to understand the full, unedited symphony. It was a time of beautiful, necessary consolidation, of weaving the fragile threads of their new beginning into a strong and lasting tapestry. One evening, as the last light of the sun bled into a twilight streaked with violet and gold, Alara sought a moment of solitude on the same high balcony where she had once stood, listening to the fearful silence of the spire. Now the air was filled with a gentle cacophony of life, the distant sound of a flute practicing a new melody, the laughter of elves sharing a meal in the gardens below, the low murmur of scholarly debate drifting from an open window. She leaned against the balustrade, breathing in the peace she had helped create, feeling a deep and hard-worn satisfaction. It was in this state of quiet reflection that she heard it. At first, it was so subtle, she thought it was a trick of the wind, whistling through the stonework. But as she stilled her own breathing and listened with more than her ears, focusing her awareness as Lyrian had taught her, the sensation clarified. It was not a sound, but a harmonic pattern, a complex and unfamiliar sequence of vibrations that tickled the edge of her spirit. It was faint, like a single thread of scent from a rare flower carried on a breeze from 1,000 miles away. And it was coming from the east, from beyond the farthest maps of the Elven realms, from the vast, uncharted forests that had always been mere legend. The consequence of this realization was like a stone dropped into the still pond of her contentment. The world, which had felt so complete and newly whole within the boundaries of the spire and its surrounding lands, suddenly yawned open into something immeasurably vast and unknown. For so long, their entire struggle had been focused inward, on saving their own society, their own memories, the idea that the Verdant Spire might not be unique, that there could be other bastions of song guardians, other cultures who had perhaps found different ways to weave music into the fabric of reality, was both thrilling and deeply humbling. Their hard-won victory was not the end of a story, but perhaps only a single, beautifully resolved chord in a symphony of planetary scale. The mysteries they had unraveled might be just the first page of a library whose shelves stretched beyond the horizon. This thrilling possibility immediately birthed a new, gentle conflict within her, a quiet tension between the heart and the horizon, the desire to explore, to follow that siren's call into the unknown and discover what other melodies the world held, was a powerful, almost physical pull. It was the same innate curiosity that had first compelled her to hum in the silent archives, now amplified by the confidence of her journey and the vastness of the potential discovery. Yet, warring against that call was a profound sense of responsibility for the fragile society she had helped birth. To leave now, even for a season, felt like abandoning a newborn creature. What if old doubts resurfaced in her absence? What if Fenler, despite his best intentions, found the pull of old habits too strong without her there, as a living reminder of their new path? The new order was stable, but it was not yet sturdy. To chase a whisper on the wind risked undermining the tangible harmony they had built with such sacrifice. Elara stood on the balcony for a long time, the cool stone beneath her hands, as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. She weighed the allure of the unknown against the demands of the known, the call of a potential new verse against the duty to the chorus she already conducted. In the end, her decision was not one of rejection, but of patience, a wisdom earned through hardship. A reckless charge into the unknown was the action of the young scholar she had once been, driven by impulse. The woman she had become understood that true strength lay in building a foundation that could endure her absence. She would not rush off immediately. Instead, She would dedicate herself completely to ensuring the new open order was not dependent on any single person, not even her. She would work with Lyrian, Fenler, and Kalin to establish a true council of equals, a rotating stewardship, so that the knowledge and the responsibility were deeply embedded in the community itself. The expedition would be planned, not as a desperate flight, but as a deliberate mission of connection, to be launched only when their home was unshakably secure. This choice carried its own subtle escalation of the stakes. The story was no longer just about the survival of one elven society. It had expanded to encompass the possibility of a larger, interconnected world of musical magic. The whisper from the east suggested that their struggle against the silence might be a shared one, a battle being fought on multiple fronts across the globe. There could be other guardians in peril, other containment systems failing, other societies clinging to fragments of the true song. Their success or failure in consolidating their own community would now directly impact their ability to become allies in a wider conflict, to share their hard-won knowledge and perhaps learn from others. The destiny of the Verdant Spire was now potentially linked to the fate of distant, unheard civilizations. The next morning, as they shared a simple breakfast of fruit and fresh bread in the sunlit main hall, Alara found a quiet moment to speak with Lyrian and Kalin. She did not speak of the whisper with dramatic urgency, but with a thoughtful excitement, describing it as a question the wind had asked her. Lyrian's ancient eyes gleamed with a spark of adventure she had not seen in them before. The world was always larger than our spire, he mused, a faint smile touching his lips. The first songs tell of journeys, of melodies carried across continents. It is only in our age of fear that we forgot how to listen for them. Kalin, his face alight with the enthusiasm of youth, immediately began thinking practically. We would need supplies, maps, though any maps we have will be blank after a certain point. We'd need to know what to look for, how to make contact without seeming like a threat. Their reactions were not of resistance, but of immediate, collaborative engagement. Together, the three of them agreed to begin the quiet, meticulous work of preparation, gathering lore about the eastern lands, studying the unique harmonic pattern Elara had detected, and most importantly, strengthening the foundations of their home so that when the time was finally right, they could step onto the path toward the whisper with clear consciences and hopeful hearts. The ceremony, when it came, was nothing like her summons before the Council of Quills. There was no circle of judgment, no silver leaf of summons, no cold, formal chamber open to an indifferent sky. Instead, the entire population of the Verdant Spire had gathered in the sun-drenched main courtyard, their faces turned not in accusation, but in quiet anticipation. They stood on the very stones where she had once led the first open chorus, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the memory of that shared song. Archivist Fenler, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but softened by a hard-won humility, stepped forward. In his hands, he did not hold a staff of office or a heavy tome of laws. He held a simple, living wreath woven from willow branches, night-blooming flowers, and strands of singing grass that emitted a soft, constant hum. He did not proclaim her a master or an archivist, titles that spoke of hierarchy and an endpoint to learning. His voice, once used for stern pronouncements, was now gentle, carrying a warmth that reached every corner of the courtyard. Elara of the Willow Glen, he began, and the use of her full name felt not like an indictment, but an acknowledgement of her entire journey. The Spire has known many guardians, but the path we walk now is new. It requires a different kind of guide. We do not bestow upon you a rank, but we ask you to accept a responsibility. We name you the keeper of the new song. As he placed the living wreath upon her head, the singing grass harmonized with the natural hum of the spire, a symbol that her authority was not imposed, but integrated, a part of the whole. The title was not a cage defining her limits, but a key unlocking a new way of being. In that moment, any lingering internal conflict within Elara, the doubt that she was worthy, the fear that she was still an imposter in the halls of power, simply melted away. She had not been seeking a title, but a purpose, and in this new name, she found it perfectly articulated. She was a keeper, not a jailer, a seeker, not a final authority. Her unique path, which had once made her an outcast, was now recognized as her greatest strength. This recognition cemented her role as the essential bridge between the world that was and the world that was still becoming. The elder scholars, those who had spent lifetimes within the old rules, saw in her a respect for the depth of their knowledge, a willingness to learn from the past without being enslaved by it. To the new generation of seekers now flocking to the Spire, she was living proof that curiosity was not a danger to be managed, but a gift to be nurtured. She moved effortlessly between a deep, technical discussion with Fenler about the resonant frequencies of different types of crystal and a joyful, playful session with children, teaching them how to feel the music in their own heartbeat. She was the translator between the language of ancient power and the language of newfound wonder, ensuring that the wisdom of the old ways could flow into the new vessel without breaking it. With this clarity of purpose, Alara immediately began to shape her new role around a single, powerful principle. She started to train the first wave of new seekers, but her teachings bore little resemblance to the rigid curricula of the past. There were no forbidden sections in the archive, no tests of obedience. Instead, she gathered her students in the courtyards, in the gardens, even on the high balconies, teaching them that the first instrument was not a harp or a voice, but a listening heart. Her lessons emphasized courage, the courage to ask why, the courage to make a mistake and learn its melody, the courage to trust one's own intuition when it harmonized with a deeper truth. She taught them that blind obedience was a form of silence, and that true harmony required every voice to contribute its unique tone. A young elf who questioned a traditional interpretation was not reprimanded, but celebrated, and the entire class would explore the question together, often discovering a nuance in the score that had been overlooked for centuries. The stakes of this new approach were profound and beautiful. The legacy of the Song Guardians was no longer the sole responsibility of a secretive, cloistered few. It was now a shared inheritance, placed into the hands of a diverse and empowered community. The gardener who understood the song of the soil, the stonemason who felt the rhythm of the rock, the cook who knew the melody of a simmering pot, all were now seen as potential guardians, each bringing a unique perspective to the great symphony. This distribution of responsibility made the songs infinitely more resilient. A legacy guarded by a single, powerful order could be broken by defeating that order. But a legacy woven into the daily life of an entire people, sung by hundreds of voices every day, could bend and adapt and survive in a way the old system never could. The songs were safe because they were no longer locked away. They had been set free to live and grow in the hearts of all. Under Elara's guidance, the Verdant Spire itself underwent a final, beautiful transformation. It was no longer a fortress of knowledge, intimidating and silent. The light that now shone from its windows was not the cold, distant light of stars observed through crystal lenses, but the warm, golden light of countless lanterns and the inner glow of a community thriving in shared purpose. The harmonies that echoed from its towers were not the secret, complex workings of a hidden elite, but a tapestry of sound woven from simple melodies, joyful laughter, earnest debate, and the constant, low hum of peaceful industry. It had become a beacon, not of warning, but of invitation. Its light reached across the forests and plains, and its music traveled on the wind, a signal to any who could hear that there was a place where song and memory were cherished, a sanctuary where the past and the future met in a vibrant, ever-unfolding present. Standing on the highest balcony of the Verdant Spire, Elara did not hear a single, unified chorus. Instead, the sound rising from the city below was a beautiful, intricate tapestry of layered melodies. A mother's lullaby wove around the rhythmic chant of stonemasons repairing a wall, which in turn harmonized with the lively tune a young apprentice was whistling on his way to the gardens. This was not the enforced, fearful silence of the old archives, nor was it the powerful, singular working of the Song of Making. This was something new, something alive. It was the sound of a people who had taken the memory of the world into their own hearts, and were now weaving it into the very fabric of their daily lives. Each voice, unique and imperfect, contributed to a symphony of shared guardianship, a music far more resilient than any secret ritual performed behind locked doors. She felt the weight of her journey settle upon her shoulders, but it was not the crushing burden she had feared in the Sanctum when the ancestral memories had first flooded her spirit. This weight was different. It was the solid, reassuring heaviness of a foundation stone, something upon which an entire future could be securely built. Every moment of doubt in the archives, every terrifying flight through the whispering woods, every strained note of the great duet with Fenler, they were not scars, but lessons etched into the cornerstone of this new age. The hidden societies of Elven scholars were hidden no more. Their sacred purpose, once a chain of duty, binding a fearful few, had been transformed into a thread of connection that now linked every baker, weaver, and child in the city. The strength of the songs was no longer in their isolation, but in their unity, in the countless threads of sound that together formed an unbreakable web. A soft smile touched Elara's lips, not of triumph, but of profound peace. She looked out over the city, where lanterns were beginning to sparkle like earthbound stars in the gathering twilight, each one a testament to a life now intertwined with the great melody. She knew, with a certainty that resonated in her very soul, that the songs were safe. They were safe not because they were locked away, but because they were loved. They were sung, they were remembered in the joy of a festival and the quiet of a solitary walk. The memory of the world was no longer a secret to be guarded, but a story to be shared, and in that sharing, it had found its true, enduring power. As the evening breeze stirred the strands of hair that had escaped her simple braid, it carried more than the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the courtyards below. It carried a whisper, not a sound for the ears, but a subtle harmonic pattern that brushed against her awareness, a faint, curious melody that seemed to echo from an impossible distance. It was the same whisper she had detected before, a siren's call from the uncharted eastern forests. She turned her face towards the horizon, where the last embers of the sun were fading behind distant, mist-shrouded peaks. The whisper was not a demand, nor was it a distress call. It was an invitation. It hinted at mysteries yet unlearned, at other ways of weaving song into the world, at potential allies or ancient cultures living in harmony with melodies they alone understood. Her story, the epic that had begun with a single, rebellious hum in a silent archive, was not ended. The verse she had lived was complete, a beautiful, closed circle of challenge and resolution. But the melody of her life was simply pausing, holding a long, peaceful fermata, awaiting the conductor's signal to begin the next,